Did you know? You could plug Game Boys into a Nintendo 64 DD and use them as controllers with screens. For those unaware, the 64 DD was a disk drive add-on for the Nintendo 64, with internet functionality for downloads and online play, an internal clock so games could track the time and date, and rewritable storage for saving massive amounts of data. All these features combined were meant to expand what a video game could be. The DD had dozens of games in development, but after 2 years of repeated delays, the add-on ended in failure and only sold 15,000 units, with all but 9 of its games ultimately cancelled. One of the games that would have supported Game Boy controllers was DT Blood Masters. The game was half funded by Nintendo and even had the so-called God of Games, Masanobu Endo, in the director's chair. Never heard of him? Endo created the arcade game Xevious, among others, and he was the longtime mentor of Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri, who later in life said Pokemon would have never existed without Endo's games inspiring him. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing of Endo, but needless to say, he is a legend, and with him in charge, DT Blood Masters was destined to be something special. DT was announced at Space World 99 as a collectible card game RPG. For simplicity's sake, if you've ever played Pokemon the card game on Game Boy, it would have been kind of like that, but with a very different tone. According to Endo, as far as the feel, it's a mix of playing cards in the neighborhood and world domination set in the near future. There's a secret organization controlling the world economy on one hand, but ordinary people appear too. It has a fully realized story with RPG progression elements. You have your own unit you're the commander of, and you design decks to battle with, so there's also simulation elements. DT Blood Masters also stood out in execution, playable on both the 64 DD and Game Boy. There were actually 2 games in development, one for each system, that you could link together to unlock more features and content. Or, as we touched on earlier, use your Game Boy as a controller with a screen. For example, you could use this in multiplayer so no one else could see the cards in your hand. Up to 4 friends could play together, provided they had 4 Game Boys. You could also download post-release cards and content off the internet, and trade cards with people online. Endo was so into what he was making that he was already talking about sequels on DD and Game Boy. But in late 2000, DT's official website announced that Blood Masters was cancelled and profusely apologized to disappointed fans. Their hand was forced because they had just found out the 64 DD's online service RANnet was getting shut down. Endo publicly considered releasing Blood Masters free to all RANnet users, which implies it was pretty much finished, but in the end decided not to. Instead, he just released a modified version of Game Boy DT as a standalone product. It launched a half year later as DT Lord of Genomes. Pokemon's catchphrase is "gotta catch 'em all," but DT's catchphrase was "children should not buy this." It was pretty story heavy and similar to Magic the Gathering in terms of gameplay. It spawned a few sequels on mobile, but unfortunately the series always stayed exclusive to Japan. No footage or screenshots of the 64 DD version were ever made public. Nintendo eventually canceled and never released the Game Boy to N64 transfer cable, but they later recycled the idea by letting fans plug Game Boy Advances into their GameCubes. When the Nintendo 64 came out, Miyamoto said it wasn't a complete machine on its own, that its true form is when it's combined with the 64 DD and Game Boy. Unfortunately, we never got a taste of that full experience. According to the 64 DD page on Wikipedia, a total of 61 games were announced for the disk drive, but cancelled in one form or another. Some were downgraded and released on a standard N64 cartridge, a few were upgraded to GameCube, others jumped ship to competing consoles, and a good chunk were cancelled entirely, sometimes when they were almost finished. We spent hundreds of hours researching primary sources in Japanese and found about 10 more games that Wikipedia left off. And also quite a few games on their list that are actually, well, fake. In an attempt to make the definitive 64 disk drive video, we're gonna cover all of them. Every single game, real or not. Most of them we scrounged up new info for, but since there are so many, we'll sum up each one in a couple of minutes, though the more important games will get closer to 5. Your Marios, your Zeldas, Pokemon, we'll get to all the big names soon enough. But first, let's do a less famous one that might have topped them all.
You must eat my flesh and clothe yourself with my fur. You must return to the human world and tell them what you know.
Jungle Emperor Leo was once touted as the biggest Nintendo game of all time. Shigeru Miyamoto's attempt to bring his childhood to life and share it with younger generations with hopes for a sequel already in mind. Information online is pretty scarce and some of it's wrong, so we went looking for more in old Japanese magazines. But before we dig into the games, first we need to touch on the history. Osamu Tezuka is probably the most famous mangaka in all Japan, where he's known as the father of manga. In the early 50s, he authored a series called Jungle Emperor, about lions living in Africa as mankind encroaches on their kingdom. In the 60s, when Miyamoto was a kid, Jungle Emperor was adapted into an anime, and continued to get more adaptations in the following decades, all with divergent stories. In the West, the franchise was renamed to Kimba the White Lion. You might remember seeing commercials when you were a kid. If not, you must have at least heard of The Lion King. Released in 1994, The Lion King drew protests in Japan saying the characters and plot plagiarized Jungle Emperor. Over 400 Japanese artists and animators signed a petition pressuring Disney to give proper credit to Tezuka. Disney denied all claims, but even the actor who voiced Simba initially thought he was in a movie about Kimba.
You must avenge my death, Kimba. I mean, Simba.
All that's to say, Jungle Emperor is a big deal, especially in Japan. Osamu Tezuka died in '89, at which point his son Makoto took over the family business. Makoto was making a new Jungle Emperor movie, and at the same time working with Miyamoto on a video game adaptation that'd be a fresh take on the original tale. Tezuka Productions was creating the game's characters, art direction, music, and sound effects, with Nintendo in charge of everything else, like gameplay and level design. For this project, Miyamoto told the press, I felt it was important that my colleague and artist Mr. Tezuka was the director, while I took a back seat. I embarked on this project to take his father's world that we were all raised on and share it with the younger generation. The game was first announced at Space World 97 with a release date of spring 98, and extremely early gameplay was shown off at the next Space World. In Japanese magazines, Tezuka said he was aiming to make a grand adventure that outshined Mario 64 and really tug at the player's heartstrings. Leo would use his intelligence and strength to fight off enemies and preserve peace in Africa. There'd be jungle settings, ocean areas, and more. Later, Miyamoto said the first few levels were already finished and undergoing polish, but they decided to push back the release date another half year. Total development, including tools and programming, was estimated to be half finished. There's some confusion online if the game was for the Nintendo 64 or the 64 disk drive. Some sites say they don't know, and Wikipedia says different systems on different pages. But according to Miyamoto, it was on a 16 megabyte cartridge, and if things went well, he wanted to make a sequel for the DD. But neither game ended up being made. Makoto Tezuka said he'd like to do some directing, Miyamoto told the press. I grew up reading his father's comics, and they had an incredible influence on my generation. Because of this, I decided to work with Makoto. But later, he decided to give priority to his Jungle Emperor Leo movie project. So we had to bring the game development to a halt. I'm very sad too. I feel sorry for Nintendo fans who are looking forward to this game. Makoto ended up releasing the film in theaters in 1997. A dual launch of the movie and the game together could have been explosive, and a disc drive sequel might have given way to a full-blown series. But sadly, now the best we can hope for is a ROM of those first few levels leaking online someday. Now a best-selling franchise, the original Animal Crossing would have never existed if it wasn't for the disc drive. It was born from the idea of the 64DD, co-creator Iguchi said in an interview. From there we came up with the concept of a game where you hang out and do stuff with a bunch of people in a single field. We all had little ideas of games we wanted to make, and Animal Crossing became all those ideas piled together. The other co-creator, Nogami, chimed in to agree. Basically, we all just wanted to make something for the 64 disk drive. They were going to make full use of the disk drive's capabilities, like the internal clock and mass amounts of rewritable storage. But when the DD died, they had to downgrade to cartridge. Some ideas got lost in the mix, like RPG-style dungeons, 4 islands based on the seasons, and online functionality. But the internal clock was so important to the core gameplay, for holidays, seasons, and the day-night cycle, that they decided to install battery-powered clocks in every cartridge. Players were also required to use controller packs to increase writable storage. Otherwise, the game couldn't remember all the changes you made to your town. Thanks to all the workarounds, they were still able to salvage a game out of it. They finally released their social simulator in 2001. It was the last N64 game Nintendo ever published. 8 months later, it was re-released on GameCube with some additional content and features that got left out of the cartridge version. Then that version got heavily reworked for the American market, with new items, content, and holidays that make sense to Westerners. The Western localization was so different and high quality, Nintendo translated it back and released it in Japan again. In other words, Animal Crossing ended up as one of the weirdest, latest N64 games with 3 unique versions in Japan alone, thanks in no small part to the death of the 64DD. Then again, the DD was the only reason Animal Crossing was dreamed up in the first place. It was inspired by the technology itself. Next up is Gendai Desenraku Ultimate War, a turn-based strategy wargame similar to Advance Wars, but much more realistic, using ranged free movement instead of squares on a grid. If you're not familiar with Advance Wars, think Fire Emblem or Final Fantasy Tactics. This is the only known footage of Ultimate War, filmed during its official reveal at Space World 1999. Plus a little more from the year after. And here are some more varied screenshots. Ultimate War was super close to coming out. When the 64DD opened for pre-orders in late 1999, Ultimate War was announced as 90% complete and scheduled to release just weeks later. The price was set to around $40, which was typical for a disc game since they were about $15 cheaper to manufacture compared to carts. Ultimate War's main campaign would have taken place in the 1990s, with Soviets invading Korea and you as a US Army commander launching a counteroffensive from Japan. There also would have been online multiplayer with up to 4 belligerents. Dice and Raku is a long-running series starting in 1985 and is still going today, and they're all very highly regarded. So it's a real shame we never got to play this one, especially since it looks pretty unique compared to the others. After Ultimate War's cancellation, the next one that came out on PC was called a masterpiece by Japanese reviewers, who said you could play it for at least 1,000 hours. The first 6 Final Fantasies had always been on Nintendo consoles. When it came time to make the 7th, Square actually started development on the Super Nintendo. After making a 2D prototype, they took a break to finish up Chrono Trigger, also for SNES. But when they came back to Final Fantasy VII, they decided to make it for the next console generation instead, in 3D. Nintendo sent them development kits, and their earliest experiments were making Cloud, Barret, and Red 13 for the Nintendo 64. Fitting lots of content and especially CGI cutscenes was difficult on cartridge, so using higher capacity 64DD discs was necessary to make the game they envisioned. But after a month or two, it just wasn't working. We made a 2,000 polygon version of Behemoth for the Nintendo 64, director Yoshinori Katase explained. But when we rendered and animated it, the frame rate was way too low. That was part of the problem with choosing Nintendo. Eventually, producer Sakaguchi casually announced, we're not developing for Nintendo anymore. And the rest is history. Square jumped ship to the PlayStation with its CD-ROMs capable of 10 times more storage than a DD floppy. And Final Fantasy VII grew into the biggest RPG of the generation. The game's hype was so all-encompassing. It almost makes you wonder, could the 64DD have been a success if it just had Final Fantasy VII? Maybe Nintendo's disk drive would have sold millions, a bunch of other games in this video would have gotten finished, and a virtuous cycle might have ensued that made the DD a must-have. Then even more games would have gotten made. Who knows? One thing's for sure though, Final Fantasy VII wouldn't have been the same. On the DD disc, it'd have to be smaller, with fewer cutscenes and less audio. Square probably would have made an entirely different game to account for the smaller storage, not just a crappier version of what they did on the PS1. Doubtless it would have been great either way, and it's fun to imagine the timeline we'd live in now if the series stayed on Nintendo. At this point, you might be wondering, why was Nintendo transitioning to floppies when CD-ROMs stored 10 times more data? Nintendo was fighting a losing battle, but cartridges and floppies still had their advantages. Carts had basically no load times, and enough writable storage to save your in-game progress, but they were expensive to make, and at launch only held 8 megabytes. CDs, on the other hand, were cheap to produce and held over 600 megabytes. But they also had long load times, and no rewritable storage. That's why PS1 games needed memory cards. Some games were a better fit for cartridges, and others for CDs. Final Fantasy couldn't fit on a cart, but if you put something like Zelda on a CD, the load times would make it virtually unplayable as it searched for specific bits of data. 64DD floppy disks were sorta a middle ground. They were 64 megabytes, fairly cheap to produce, with only minimal load times. But there was one thing that made floppies special: mass amounts of rewritable storage. Up to 38 of its 64 megabytes could be used for saving data, equal to 300 PlayStation memory cards. With that, entirely new kinds of games could be made, games that could remember everything, offering experiences impossible on CD or cartridge, like Zelda 64, Mother 3, and Cabbage. You know what? Let's talk about Cabbage right now, actually. One of the most promising 64DD projects, which would have been revolutionary if it ever came out, was a game called Cabbage, a virtual pet simulator taking full advantage of the disk drive's capabilities. Created by an all-star team, led by Shikasato Itoi, creator and director of the Mother series, Tsunekazu Ishihara, founder and president of the Pokemon Company, Satoru Iwata, the genius programmer instrumental in bringing Pokemon to the West and later became president of all Nintendo, and Shigeru Miyamoto, who needs no introduction. Unfortunately, no images or footage were ever released from its years-long development, because they wanted to wait till launch was imminent to make a big splash with the character reveals. The core ideas and mechanics were explained in various magazines and web interviews, so that's what we'll be digging into in the next few minutes. According to Itoi, in a word, it's a breeding game. A game where you can play with your friends. We're flying this game under the radar of Yamauchi, the Nintendo president. That's what's fun about it. There'd be more than one creature, according to Iwata. You'd be breeding 10 different kinds of creatures. And they weren't literal cabbages, by the way. That was just a word Itoi blurted out and everyone seemed to like. Cabbage is just the name for a little creature, Miyamoto explained. You can buy it things, give it food, and raise it. The game uses the 64DD's internal clock, meaning the creature can evolve and change even if you're not playing. You can go out for a few hours and find your creature has totally changed when you get back. But it's inevitable players will have to leave their house. To stop Cabbage from being neglected, a Game Boy cartridge can be used as a basket. You can put Cabbage in his basket and take him with you, using the Game Boy to cater to his every wish. Of course, the Game Boy screen will look different than the 64DD version. When you get home, you can release him back into the virtual world on your TV. While the 64DD will be the major base for playing the game, we want people to download specific stages onto a Game Boy cartridge so they can take it with them on the train to work or school. We've been showing Pikachu because it's good illustrative B-roll, but they said the concept was more like Tamagotchi, the Japanese digital pets that took over the world around the same time as Pokemon, selling over 40 million units from 1996 to 98. But Cabbage actually started development 4 years before Tamagotchi, as a Game Boy game, and it was going to be a lot more ambitious than Tamagotchi. The Dream Team had big plans, like releasing more discs over time that provide your Cabbage with new equipment. Swings, slides, ponds, all kind of stuff that alter the game and how its Cabbages evolved. They were going to set up kiosks at stores, where you'd insert discs to download content and events. You could also download content through 64DD online as cheap microtransactions, and trade Cabbage toys back and forth with your friends. The 64DD's internal clock was so integral. The entire reason the DD even had a clock is because Iwata asked Nintendo to make it a hardware feature specifically for Cabbage. If not for that, there would have never been an Animal Crossing. Iwata was also cooking up systems that would let Cabbage simulate the thoughts and genes of human beings, so the creatures evolved in ways that the creators couldn't anticipate. Talking about how DD hardware works, he said, there can be slightly different content on each disc, even for the same game. The ID number's written onto the disc based on the exact second it's manufactured, and the software can change the algorithm and content of the game based on that ID number. In other words, there's a possibility of playing one-of-a-kind, self-reproducing software without knowing what'll happen next. We're going to use sophisticated programs that mimic the genetics of living things to create characters that develop in unpredictable ways, just like real creatures. The patterns are infinite. We can finally see it all coming together, Tighe proclaimed in 1997. Now that Iwata from HAL Labs has joined us, the tools we're using to make Cabbage are drastically modernizing. Making those tools is the most laborious part, so it looks like that part's finishing up. And it's all moving forward. But by 2000, Cabbage had kinda fizzled out. Miyamoto said the Japanese gaming market was shrinking and Tighe and Ishihara had gotten too busy. Ishihara with Pokemon and Tighe with Mother 3, which, as you'll hear about later, never got finished either, at least not the original version. Miyamoto thought maybe they could eventually pull themselves together and finish Cabbage for GameCube, but that never happened. Years later, he repurposed some of Cabbage's ideas to make Nintendogs, which went on to become the Nintendo DS's second best-selling game of all time. Now, if you're still having trouble imagining what Cabbage would have been like to play, Miyamoto said it would be a lot like Seaman. You know Seaman, right?
Hey kids, want to see something interesting?
One of the strangest games ever made. And yes, that was Seaman mating, and yeah, one of them's dead now. Simply put, it's a bizarre pet sim where you gotta hatch and keep Seaman alive while he asks you countless questions. You answer through a microphone, he learns everything about you, gets philosophical, and goes through the stages of metamorphosis over several real-life weeks. Seaman launched on Dreamcast, but it was almost a 64DD game first. Seaman's creator, Yuta Saito, was friends with Miyamoto, and Miyamoto was the first person he ever showed the concept for Seaman, who'd stay personally involved with its development. Miyamoto-san really likes strange and different concepts, Saito explained. So while Seaman was released on Dreamcast, behind the scenes we came very close to choosing to develop the game for the Nintendo 64 DD. Saito was friends with Iwata as well, who years later got Saito working on a 3DS version, but it ended up going unfinished, which led to the old friends falling out. Seaman 3DS was cancelled, and Iwata tragically lost his battle with cancer not long after. Next up is Derby Stallion 64DD. It would have been the 16th entry in the popular horse racing and business simulator franchise that's still going strong today, despite having never left Japan. To be fair, it's always been pretty Japan-centric, and might not appeal to overseas audiences. The way it works is, you don't directly control the actual racing. It's all about acquiring quality steeds, breeding them, training them, gambling, and so on. When it comes time to race, you just watch, and it's a pretty small percentage of your playtime. Similar to DT Bloodmasters and Cabbage, you could hook up a Game Boy to continue your campaign on the go, or use your Game Boy as a controller. So in multiplayer, you could do stuff like place bets without opponents seeing what you're doing. The game also presumably would have utilized the 64DD's internet functions to let you race against your pals online, since that had been a feature of the series as far back as the Famicom days. Ultimately, like so many disk drive projects, Derby Stallion 64 did eventually come out, but just as a downgraded version on a standard N64 N64 cartridge, which meant cutting Game Boy support, online play, and probably some additional perks that hadn't been announced yet. It ended up as the second to last N64 game ever released.
You have entered a restricted area.
Every system gets ports, and the 64DD was no exception. Like Unreal, the first-person shooter that took the PC world by storm in '98 and garnered universal praise with 9 and 10 out of 10 review scores across the board. Calling it an FPS almost doesn't do it justice. It's really more akin to Metroid Prime than your typical shoot-'em-up. To sum up the setting in a single sentence, the player takes control of human prisoner 849, whose transport vessel crashes on an uncharted planet full of alien slaves. Then after all the other crash survivors are murdered, has to make his way to the slaver alien's queen to end her reign in a hail of bullets. The developers at Epic Games said they could have made it for regular old N64, but were aiming for the 64DD to make the console port as good as it could be. Back in those days, ports were often a different and unique experience compared to the original. Doom for PS1 comes to mind with its edited levels and bizarre soundtrack. Or heck, even Doom 64, which diverted so much from the PC original, we don't think you can even call it a port. So it would have been interesting to see how Unreal 64 might have turned out, especially since it never ended up getting ported to any console, ever. In addition to Unreal, Epic Games was bringing one more of their PC titles to Nintendo's disk drive, 7th Legion. 7th Legion was a real-time strategy set in the distant future where overpopulation and dwindling natural resources on Earth leads the government to evacuate a select few, who are called the Chosen, while the rest of humanity is left to perish on our dying planet.
The time came for the ships to depart. Thousands were slaughtered and widespread panic broke out as people realized they had not been chosen in the selection process. Only the smart, powerful, and rich were chosen.
Only the most worthy specimens of the human race would be allowed to leave the planet.
Earth survivors eventually band themselves into 7 legions who fight over what's left. But centuries later, the descendants of the Chosen return to conquer them and take Earth back for themselves. It's a desirable planet once again, you see, because hundreds of years with minimal humans allowed the planet to heal. 7th Legion had 2 single-player campaigns, one where you play as the survivors who have all gathered forces into one legion, the 7th Legion, and in the other campaign you play as the Chosen. Interestingly, the console port was being developed by DMA Design, the studio that later changed its name to Rockstar and made a little game called Grand Theft Auto. The devs were explicit that 7th Legion would not be a straight port, more like a reimagining tailor-made for the 64DD. Sounded promising, but alas, it was not meant to be. One of the few 64DD games that did come out was SimCity 64, the city-building simulation game. Though fairly similar to SimCity 2000, it had a lot of big upgrades. New graphics, street view, individual people and vehicles, being able to see the city at night, and SimCity creator Will Wright being the in-game advisor. Will Wright and Miyamoto are fans of each other in real life, actually. They collaborated on the game, and Wright was even turned into a character in Zelda Link's Awakening. Another game of his, Simcopter 64, was supposed to come out on the disk drive, but never made it.
This is an alert from Central Dispatch. Traffic jam reported. Police request aerial assistance.
Yes, this footage is very rough. It's an early demo, recently acquired by the Video Game History Foundation, so don't think it's what the final game would have looked like. They preserved it so you can play it any time you want, and this is us playing it right now. Originally it was for the N64, but after this demo was poorly received at E3 '97, they announced it was going to get upgraded to a DD floppy instead. It's based on the 1996 PC game Simcopter, which had 30 cities filled with missions like catching criminals, search and rescue, putting out fires, and dispersing riots. Completing missions gets you points and money for unlocking more missions and bigger, better helicopters. There was other stuff like nuclear explosions and UFOs abducting people, but that's the main gameplay loop. Like SimCity 64, Simcopter 64 would have been more of a reimagining than a straight port, and if you owned both games, you could upload metropolises you made in SimCity into Simcopter. When Copter got cancelled, a chopper was integrated into SimCity 64, but it kinda sucked. Reviewers at the time complained about low frame rates, and there's basically nothing to do. It's probably safe to assume if Simcopter 64 had been its own full-fledged game, the wrinkles could have gotten ironed out with features more fleshed out than what we got tacked onto SimCity. That never happened though, and the game was eventually cancelled in 1999. A later build than what you're seeing now, about 6 months further into development, was obtained by a Redditor in 2022, who said he traded some SNES games for it. He posted video and photos on the N64 subreddit. Then of course people begged him to dump it so everyone could play, at which point he deleted his Reddit and his Twitter accounts and disappeared. So unfortunately, we may never get to play it.
After a vain attempt to rebuild their marriage, Jamie and Gillian separate. Following extensive special military training, Gillian is ordered to report to Neo-Kobe City as a junker, effective today.
After the first Metal Gear, Hideo Kojima made the cyberpunk graphic adventure Snatcher. You play as amnesiac detective Gillian Seed, whose job as a junker takes him across Japan in the 2040s hunting down Snatchers, murderous robots that steal their victims' skin and replace them in society. Kojima's dystopian epic originally released in 1988, which would have made it by far the oldest game ported to the disk drive. We're not so sure this port was even real though. Wikipedia, the 64DD wiki, and various other sites have big lists of every cancelled disk drive game, which are different, but all include Snatcher. Their only source is an issue of video games, the Ultimate Gaming magazine, which says the port's coming, but frankly, it sounds a bit off. For starters, they don't even say how they heard about the port, like a statement from Konami or claiming to know an anonymous insider, so we did some digging to see if it was true. We talked to 4 guys who worked in ports and localizations at Konami and Nintendo back then. They all thought it was fake or never heard of it. We also talked to some 64DD experts and Snatcher superfans. Same thing. Except for that one fishy magazine, there's no source for Snatcher 64DD cited anywhere on the internet, even in Japanese. A similar claim was recently added to the Konami wiki by an anonymous user, but when we started asking about it, the claim was deleted by the wiki's admins. Japanese magazines back then had big lists of announced and upcoming games, and we never saw Snatcher appear on any of them. We also reached out to that fishy magazine's author, Wataru Maruyama, but he never replied. We did manage to speak with the magazine's associate editor, Jeff Higgins, though, who told us Wataru got his information from reading Japanese magazines. That was common back then, by the way. That's how everyone got a lot of their info, from IGN to EGM. But Jeff suspects Snatcher DD was just a rumor to begin with. Quote, I could see them peddling some BS if it meant getting eyes to read their scoops. The thing is, we want it to be true. A Kojima game coming to 64DD could have been awesome, especially since previous ports added new content. But we spent a lot of time digging, and sadly, it's almost certainly fake. So we're gonna have to cross this one off the list of cancelled DD games.
We shouldn't be seen talking, so I'll be brief. Let's go over this one last time. The substitution of the president will be executed the day after tomorrow in New York City. You are not to leave the president's side no matter what.
Next up, it's Hybrid Heaven, Nintendo console's answer to Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear was made by Konami, and Hybrid Heaven was also made by Konami. It was actually a different internal team trying to outdo their co-workers. Partially inspired by Blade Runner, Hybrid Heaven stars a guy named Diaz, a synthetic human hybrid created by an alien race who want to replace Earth's leaders with clones loyal to the extraterrestrials, starting with the President of the United States. But Diaz betrays the aliens and turns the tables on his masters. Besides Snatcher, Hybrid Heaven's the only Konami title on wiki lists of cancelled DD games. Though this one's not especially true either, unfortunately. Even Wikipedia's source, an IGN article, only says it could come out on 64DD. We found an old magazine interview with Konami's N64 development head, Katsuya Nage, who gives a fuller explanation. In fact, this is probably the same interview IGN pulled from back in the day to write their article. Talking about Hybrid Heaven and Konami's DD plans in general, he says they're not announcing anything for the add-on, though they'll consider putting cartridge games on DD if it sells enough units. With the benefit of hindsight, we now know that only 15,000 disc drives were ever sold, which is why Konami never announced a single title. Technically speaking, any N64 game could release on disc, but none of them ever did. As for how Hybrid Heaven turned out when it finally landed on N64, reviewers gave it 7s and 8s, praising its intelligent combat, enigmatic story, and calling it a mix between Metal Gear, Tomb Raider, and Final Fantasy. Maybe if it had been developed specifically for the DD, it could have fared even better, and been the add-on's killer app that it so desperately needed. Shiren the Wanderer 2, Shiren's Castle, and the Oni Invasion is one of the generation's best RPGs that never left Japan. Developed by Chunsoft and published by Nintendo. Though it's part of the Mystery Dungeon franchise, Shiren branched off as its own sub-series starting on Satellaview. You've probably heard of it, but in case you haven't, the Satellaview was a niche add-on for Super Famicom, the 64DD of the previous generation, basically. So naturally, Shiren 2 was announced for the 64 disk drive, but after a couple of years, and for the usual reasons, got downgraded to cartridge. Chunsoft never explained how Shiren planned to use the DD technology. Who knows, maybe it could have had a day-night cycle like its sequels instead of just occasional cutscenes of sundowns. But despite any compromises, the cartridge still managed to hit #1 on Japanese sales charts, and scored 9.5 out of 10 from Famitsu, making you wonder if the DD version would have fared even better. To sum up the story, 10-year-old Shiren's wandering the mountains with his weasel ferret and stops to eat at the village Natane. An Oni tribe attacks, so Shiren's tasked with constructing a defensive castle. That's where you come in. finding stone, iron, and other materials to build fortifications which you find in the dungeons peppered throughout the open world. Tougher dungeons have stronger resources. The game has a fairly unique turn-based battle system, leveling up, and as is typical for the Mystery Dungeon series, the dungeons are semi-randomized for replayability. Once you finish the castle, it's time to fend off the Oni. Unfortunately, Shiren 2 only released in Japan, but thanks to its popularity, fans eventually filled the gap with a translation patch. Animal Eater, without a doubt, was one of the strangest games destined for the disk drive. Brought to you by the guys behind Parappa the Rapper and Jungle Park, with Miyamoto signed on as a producer, Animal Eater defies genre. In pursuit of climbing the tippy top of the food chain, you collect upgrades, level up, mutate, mate, and eat everything in sight. If you can't beat a particular boss, you might need to evolve, or reproduce with different kinds of females and take control of the offspring best equipped for the fight. Though you'll need to beef up the baby before he's ready, of course. Back then, in the early 3D era, other games looked more or less the same, so the devs went for a low-poly cube aesthetic to stand out. At this point, we need to digress for a quick inside baseball history lesson. Animal Eater was a Marigold management game, basically a group of small studios co-funded by Nintendo because the N64 wasn't getting enough third-party support. Fun fact, the word Marigold is a mix between Nintendo's mascot Mario and a seagull, the mascot of Recruit, the other co-founder. Nintendo and Recruit also jointly owned RandNet, the 64DD's online service, with RandNet's name also being a combination of Recruit and Nintendo. Marigold Management's goal was to let creatives make weird games without the pressures of market forces, to bring passion projects to life without worrying so much about profits. Marigold provided advice and mentorship and took care of the small studio's finances, sales, PR, debugging, and other mundane tasks so the creators could focus solely on innovation with no deadlines. The leadership team included Pokemon producer Ishihara and Shiren the Wanderer producer Nakamura. Marigold dissolved in the GameCube era, but before that they worked on DD games like Doshin the Giant, DT Bloodmasters, and Derby Stallion, and for N64, Custom Robo and Hey You Pikachu. All very unique, and mostly well received. There was real magic over at Marigold. We could do a whole video just about Marigold, but maybe another time. Let's get back to Animal Eater. Like so many other disc games, eventually it got moved over to cartridge. We went looking through Japanese magazine interviews, and according to the designers, the N64 version was 100% complete. Even the instruction manual was a done deal. But one day Miyamoto was like, actually let's not release it. GameCube's coming out, we'll port it over there instead. They said the N64 and the GameCube versions were almost identical, except the resolution and graphics were a little smoother and they could have more animals on screen at once. That N64 build actually leaked online not too long ago. A guy named Martin Nielsen runs the small site NES World. He'd come into possession of some prototype cards, then let them gather dust in a box for 10 years, thinking a lot of it was junk. Finally, in 2021, he took the time to root around in them, and lo and behold, one turned out to be Animal Eater 64. It's now playable online, thanks to Martin. As for the GameCube version, when it finally hit store shelves in 2002, the title was localized as Cubivore, Survival of the Fittest. Critics were confused but positive, mostly giving it 7s in the West and 8s in Japan. Consumers were even more confused, unfortunately, and turned off by the simplistic graphics, so hardly anyone bought it. In recent years, though, people have come around to the idea that it's an overlooked gem. But since the low sales led to few copies being printed, nowadays, Johnny-come-latelys are having to pay $500 as the price for not realizing sooner. Out of the dozens of DD games in development, only 9 ended up releasing. 4 of them were Mario Artist games. Mario Artist Paint Studio was a launch title, and essentially served as a sequel to Mario Paint on Super Nintendo. It also came with some preloaded 3D environments you could explore, edit, and take pictures in, which seemed out of place in a paint game, right? The reason it's there is because Paint Studio started development as a sort of god game called Creator, but Nintendo Japan and Nintendo of America fought over its direction, with Japan emerging victorious and turning it into Mario Paint. The Pokemon Snap exploration mode was left over as the bones of Creator's rotting carcass. But anyway, a couple months after Paint Studio, Mario Artist Talent Studio came out, which was all about making your own characters and playing around with them. A few months later, Mario Artist Communication Kit, which served as a bank to deposit stuff you made in the other entries and share your creations online. And finally, the last game ever released for 64DD, Mario Artist Polygon Studio was a 3D graphics editor that let you make your own polygonal objects. All 4 games worked together, but there was also a 5th entry that never came out, Mario Artist Soundmaker, which is exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's a sound maker. We did a dedicated video on the Artist series a few years ago, so if you're interested, it's got more details on that series. And although they weren't Mario themed, there were a few more Maker games that got cancelled before so much as a screenshot could be made public. DD Sequencer for composing music, Video Jockey Maker for editing video, Game Maker for making your own games, and Graphical Message Maker, which, to be honest, that one probably didn't need to exist anyway. Regardless, DD floppies were the perfect medium for these kind of games, thanks to their 38 megabytes of rewritable storage. Official PS1 memory cards only held 1/8 of a megabyte, meaning DD games could save 300 times more data than PlayStation games. You can save a whole lot of creations on one disc. These kind of games were part of Nintendo's strategy for rethinking what video games could be. Most other games are like little boxed gardens, which Miyamoto likened to Disneylands, full of rides and amusements the developers cooked up to entertain you. But Miyamoto said these maker games were like dropping you in a field with nothing but a stick to play with, and you have to make your own fun. Wait, that sounds kinda boring as hell, doesn't it? No wonder no one bought the DD. He really did say that, but I think what he was trying to say is these games drop you in a field and give you the tools to make your own rides, your own Disneyland. But even still, that sort of thinking only appeals to a niche audience. That said, Mario Artist is the prime example for another more interesting strategy for rethinking the games industry, what Nintendo called the product group concept. Games that could be played on their own, but enhanced when combined with more games. You can play Paint Studio by itself, but you can do more if you have the other Mario Artists too. SimCity was at the core of the second product group. Simcopter's attached, of course, but Miyamoto also wanted to expand it with a crazy taxi style of game where you drive around some cities, racing customers to their destinations as fast as possible. Or another where you listen to radio traffic reports so you can plan out the ideal street route to outrun cops chasing you. DD floppies were cheap to produce and easily overwritten, so smaller games and expansions were much more feasible than what was possible on cartridges. Miyamoto said these sorts of budget titles might sell for as little as $5. Different product groups could overlap as well, like letting you turn your drawings into SimCity citizens. That feature did ship actually, but most other ideas fizzled out when the DD failed to find an audience. While Mario and Zelda were transitioning to 3D, Yoshi remained as one of the few holdouts clinging to 2 dimensions. His '97 sequel was originally called Yoshi's Island 64 as a continuation of the best-selling SNES title, but eventually got rebranded as Yoshi's Story. It's on Wikipedia's list of announced 64DD games, with their only source being IGN's response to a reader's email, where IGN claims unnamed Nintendo of America representatives told them in private it'd be on disc. But Nintendo Japan always said Yoshi was a cartridge game, before IGN's mailbag, and after. They even said it was for N64 at Space World 96, literally the same event that Nintendo of America told IGN it was a disc game. Every Japanese magazine preview listed it as an N64 title as well, going back to the very beginning. We're not saying IGN's lying, maybe Nintendo of America did say that, but if so, it appears they were misinformed. Nintendo's other premier 2.5D title, Kirby 64, is a similar story. It's on Wikipedia's list too, but without any citation. We went through tons of Japanese magazines, and again, Kirby was always said to be for the N64. Same goes for the internet. At the very start of development, Miyamoto said it was coming to N64. IGN asked him, "Do you mean 64DD?" And Miyamoto said no, they're making it as a cartridge game, though it is transferable in either format. But that could be said for pretty much any N64 game, they could all be transferred to disc. So it doesn't seem like Kirby was ever meant for DD either. Now, it's possible that there were discussions at Nintendo like, hey, maybe the 64DD will launch in '97 and sell 1 billion units, and by the time Yoshi and Kirby are done, it'll make sense to put them on disc. But we can't find proof either game was ever announced for DD, seriously considered, or made to use the disk drive's capabilities. We can only find evidence to the contrary, so we don't think Yoshi and Kirby really belong on a list of canceled disc games. Okay, at this point we need to digress. We've been giving Wikipedia a hard time, but we don't want you to get the wrong idea. They're generally a great source of information, and making this video without their DD games list as a springboard would have been even more laborious. Wikipedia gets it right most of the time, but this particular list hasn't been maintained in ages. The only reason we keep bringing it up is because your average gamer who's curious about 64DD games will probably Google and end up on this Wikipedia page and take it at face value. Or the 64DD wikis list, which is mostly the same as Wikipedia's but with no sourcing. So we feel it's appropriate to point out where wikis got it wrong, and add new information where we were able to find it. And hey, we make mistakes too. By the time you're seeing this, there's probably already comments rightfully pointing out errors in this video, or some context that we should have included. Wikipedia covers every subject known to man, so their job's infinitely more difficult to accomplish without ever being wrong. And their contributors do it for free. We spent hundreds of hours on this video and had it proofread by 64DD experts like Luigi Blood and series superfans like Cody Nicolo. But we don't have every Japanese magazine, and we don't know everything. After this video has been seen by thousands of people, it's inevitable some will know more than us about certain subjects. Some of you all might have even worked on some of these canceled games. So please feel free to point out errors in the comments, or if your information's of a more sensitive nature, you can always contact us privately through Twitter. In summary, Wikipedia is a great, accessible resource, but it's not a primary source. There's always more information than what's on Wiki, and no one can be right 100% of the time. That applies to Wikipedia, IGN, and us too. Okay, on to the next game. Fin was a dolphin bird pet sim. Think of him like a simpler, kid-friendly seaman. That game was rated T for teen, but Fin's E for everyone. It had a 24-hour real-time day-night cycle, weather, and made use of a microphone so you could talk to him. Though he couldn't talk back like Seaman. Not in human words anyway. Fin's planet, Tighe, had a few different environments occasionally populated by alien creatures. You can feed Fin and take care of his other needs like thirst and happiness, but he's more than capable of foraging his own food and taking care of himself. It's really more like a wildlife observation game than a survivalist pet sim. He'll never drop dead from fatigue, get mated to death, or anything like that. But it's fun to hang out with him, especially with the voice interactivity, and even more so for a kid in the 90s. You might be surprised to hear this game did come out, as Fin on Tighe, The Magic Planet, which released only on PC in 1996. It was supposed to land on Nintendo's disk drive a couple years later, but never did. The publishers at Fujitsu were really trying to make Fin the next big thing. They released a deluxe edition with added content, all kinds of different toys and merch, and even a Japanese TV show, though it never got past the pilot episode. Overall, the game seems to have been a moderate success, selling around 500,000 copies. But you'll never guess who the lead producer was. Believe it or not, it was Makoto Tezuka, the Jungle Emperor guy. Fin was the only game he ever finished. Afterwards, he went back to his movies. Tighe 64 DD was reportedly going to be very different than the PC editions, but details on how exactly were scant. If you want to hear more about the original release, check out LGR's channel. He's got a great 20-minute review about Fin for PC, a game that otherwise has mostly been forgotten nowadays. It's also free to download on abandonware sites if you want to play it yourself. A 64DD version of Super Mario 64 was exhibited at Space World 96 and shown off in lots of magazines, but never came out. Fans and gaming press alike were left speculating about what exactly the game was. An expansion for the original? Maybe an enhanced remaster? Almost 2 decades of theories were finally put to rest in 2014, when a French N64 collector named Jimmy130 found out a long-lost copy was sitting in a second-hand shop in Japan. God only knows how it got there. The shop seemingly had no idea the kind of treasure they had, so when they listed it on Yahoo Auctions, Jimmy bought it. It's primarily the same as the cartridge release, though it's got a few slight differences. You might have noticed the first one already, the music. Here's a couple comparisons. Cart versus disc. Due to the disc format, there's occasional brief load times. And also some random photos in the internal data, presumably used for testing, like selfies of Atsushi Watanabe, who worked at Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division. But there's no extra levels or enhanced graphics, nothing like that. And the music's actually the same as the original, just recompiled with a different sound engine. It's not like Nintendo went through the trouble of recomposing it. So, disappointingly, it looks like it was just a tech demo all along, never meant to become an actual product, and thus, not technically a cancelled game. Folks thought it was for decades though, and some old rumors are still up on the internet, so we thought we'd include it on our list. And heck, it's just an interesting piece of 64DD history. You'll be happy to hear the ROM's been dumped, so nowadays anyone can download Super Mario 64 DD and play it for themselves. That's Super Mario 128, not Super Mario 64 2. They were 2 different projects, though they sometimes get conflated. 128 was a GameCube tech demo shown off at Space World 2000 that eventually kinda turned into Mario Galaxy and Pikmin. Mario 64 2 was for 64DD, so that's the one we're gonna dig into. It was the last game Miyamoto ever directed, or at least it would have been, if he ever finished it. As soon as he completed the first game, he said, "I couldn't put everything into Super Mario 64 that I really wanted, so we've decided to continue working toward a sequel, which will take about 1.5 years at least." Later adding, the first game is only using about 60% of the N64's hardware power, you see. There's really so much more we could do, so we decided to save those ideas for next time. Luigi was famously cut from Mario 64, and bringing him back was a core component of the sequel. But not for multiplayer, it'd be more like Resident Evil 0 or Pikmin 2, where you control both or switch between Mario and Luigi for puzzle solving and other utilities left up to our imaginations. Yoshi also got cut from the original, except for a post-game cameo, and Japanese magazines reported he'd be returning in a more prominent role, though Miyamoto never confirmed that detail. I'm changing the gameplay system, adding more enemies and retooling the display and graphics, he teased months later. Last time I only designed for a cartridge, but next time I will take advantage of the potential of the 64DD. I plan to utilize the 64DD's read and write functions to create a new type of game. After a couple of years, he said the game was half finished and he had a prototype with Mario and Luigi running around on his desk. But he didn't have time to focus on it because he was too busy with Zelda 64. Miyamoto promised that once Zelda was done, he'd refocus on his favorite plumber. But he was overseeing about 10 games at once as producer and supervisor, and having a hard time being everywhere at once. Yoshi's Story got delayed, so he moved developers over there to finish it up quicker, but that caused Zelda to get delayed, and then in turn, got Mario delayed. Meanwhile, he was also producing Star Fox, Mario Kart, Mario Artist, Pokemon Snap, F-Zero, Mario RPG 2, Smash Bros, and more. Nintendo had laid too much on his lap, more than one man could handle. But still, development continued, with him later saying his team was also experimenting with 4-player split screen, and insiders telling press the other two characters were Peach and Toad. It's a long, complicated mess of a story. We just gave you the cliff notes, but if you want the longer version, we did a dedicated video on Mario 128 and 64-2 a few years ago. To wrap up this summary though, Miyamoto's Tower of Cards eventually collapsed, resulting in 64-2 quietly getting cancelled, along with a lot of other games you're hearing about in this video. Miyamoto stayed on as series producer, but gave the director's chair to Yoshiaki Koizumi, who went on to make the Mario 128 tech demo, Sunshine, Galaxy, and is still directing 3D Mario to this day. No footage or screenshots were ever made public of 64-2. And for fans hoping the prototype will leak online someday, it remains probably the holiest of 64DD holy grails. We debunked Yoshi's Story being a 64DD game earlier, but while we were reading up on Mario 64-2, we stumbled over an interesting tease from Miyamoto. Talking 1 year after Yoshi's Story was already out, he says they're now experimenting with a DD Yoshi game, which the interviewers interpret to mean Yoshi's Story 2 is in the works, although it also could have been a disc expansion for the original. But the way things turned out, Yoshi didn't get another game until 2004 on the Game Boy Advance. I don't know if it's accurate to call these Yoshi 64DD experiments a cancelled game exactly, but still, it's interesting to learn the disk drive could have not only had Mario 2, but Yoshi 2 as well. If it did come out, it might have been the only 2D platformer in the add-on's entire library. Metal Slayer Glory 2 isn't on any disk drive game lists, but it should be. This one's not appealing in the sense you'd necessarily want to play it, but because it's bizarre and of extreme historical significance. You'll see what we mean, but before we get to the DD, you'll need some background on the first game. In 1987, HAL Laboratory artist Yoshimiru Hoshi was putting together a presentation at his desk when Satoru Iwata walked by and was like, "Wow, I've never seen graphics that good. Look at those characters. You don't even need to make a presentation, I hereby approve your game. In fact, I'm going to help you make it." Iwata served as both programmer and producer until the game was finally completed 4 years later. It's famous for being one of the most expensive Famicom games of its time, Iwata recalled with a laugh. It's actually kind of amazing we stuck to it, persevered, and eventually released it. But from a management perspective, it was a mistake. At 8 megabytes, the cartridge was insanely huge for a Famicom game. That's the same size as Mario 64 a couple console generations later. Unfortunately, HAL went bankrupt trying to promote it. Nintendo said they'd bail them out, but only if Iwata was promoted to become HAL's new president. HAL accepted. A decade later, Iwata became president of Nintendo itself. All Nintendo history in the years since would have been a lot different, and probably worse, if it wasn't for Metal Slayer Glory. As for the game itself, it's a text-based adventure set in 2062, not long after a great war between space colonies. The protagonists sort of accidentally come into possession of a Metal Slayer Gundam, which houses a secret message warning the Earth is in danger. They investigate and find out the space colony war was a cover-up, and the real war was between colonists and aliens. Not only that, but the aliens are capable of disguising themselves as humans, and have infiltrated our government. We won't spoil the rest. A fan translation came out in 2018 if you want to experience it yourself. Yoshimiru wanted to make a sequel for 64DD and actually wrote a book about it in 2013 called The Truth Behind the Phantom Game Project. It took a while to get a copy and have it translated, but it was worth the trouble. Honestly, we wish every scrapped project got a book like this. It says in 1997, Yoshimiru pitched a prequel starring Yayoi Kisaragi, who played a bit part as a waitress and secret soldier in the first game. This prequel takes place 1 year earlier and also features her 4 sisters, all between the ages 12 and 19, each with lengthy bios detailing their unique personalities. It's a girls' game, Yoshimiru writes. The title would have been The 5 Kisaragi Sisters, spread out over 5 discs, with each sub-story being about 3 hours long and centered around a different sister. They'd release a few months apart and use the 64DD to its fullest potential. Rewritable storage, voice acting, and using all that disk space for several novels worth of dialogue. Every disc could be played on its own, but your save data carried over if you played them all, with incentives to replay again and again. But the further you get into Yoshimiru's book, the more you realize it's not exactly for girls. It's actually what the Japanese call a gal's game. If you're not familiar, that means it's a game starring attractive young girls with teenage boys as its target audience. For example, Mitsuke, the 17-year-old. She does have a distinct backstory and personality, but the first sentence of her bio says she's a big-breasted girl with a 96F bra size. Double exclamation marks. Now, the first game did have a flirty male lead and occasionally panty shots and stuff like that, but it was all in service to a sci-fi narrative. I'd like to think the 64DD prequel would have had a riveting story of its own, but the book doesn't get into any of that at all. It's only interested in telling us about the girls, and saying again and again, making it very clear that this is a gal's game. We found Yoshimuro on Twitter and asked, so what is the story? He said it's set in a Yokohama school where you build relationships with the 5 sisters. We inquired further, asking if it ultimately lead to science fiction like the first game. His answer? There was nothing sci-fi about it. Then he made an uwu face. I almost can't believe that this was the pitch to follow up the most advanced game ever released for Famicom. So anyways, about that pitch, Yoshimuro took everything you'd just seen and showed it to Nintendo, who said, actually the 64DD is getting delayed and things are kinda uncertain right now. So we're sorry to say, maybe this isn't the best time to begin development. In his book, Yoshimuro admits, in hindsight, the gal's angle might have been a problem too. Hell told him that since the prequel wasn't going to happen, they'd let him port the first game to Super Famicom instead. Yoshimuro took that ball and ran with it, and with a small team, made more than a port. It was a full remake with better graphics and some R-rated dialogue cut from the original. Metal Slayer Glory, Director's Cut, came out in late 2000. It was the last game ever released for the Super Famicom. Yoshimuro has made other stuff in his career, but he considers Metal Slayer Glory his life's work. In the decades since, he's made more Slayer manga, books, a drama CD, toys, and never stopped dreaming about one more playable experience. Currently, he's hoping to make it a virtual reality game. Well, we're almost an hour in, and we've barely covered half the games. We haven't even gotten to some of the big ones like Pokemon, Zelda, Donkey Kong, and Mother 3. After rare success with the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, they started making a new game for Super Nintendo codenamed Project Dream, also known as Dream Land of Giants. Led by Rare co-founder Tim Stamper, Dream was an action RPG starring a boy named Edson and his dog Dinger, who cross swords with pirates on the hunt for a magic potion that'll make their ships fly. Edson and his girlfriend have to flee the pirates' wrath, and that's how the story gets going, with fantastical elements like giants and dinosaurs thrown in for good measure. I started at Rare in October 1995, composer Grant Kirkhope recalled. I was shown Dream running on the SNES and was blown away. It looked beautiful and was obviously going to be a big step up from Donkey Kong Country. The console generation was coming to a close, so development moved to the 64DD. According to a couple devs we talked to, the DD was chosen over the standard N64 for its extra storage, rather than any DD-specific features. At this point, Dream dropped the fantasy feel in favor of a golden age of piracy theme, to avoid seeming childish. Over 100 tracks of music were made, some of which you're hearing now. After a while, Stamper felt the boy hero wasn't working in this more mature world and wanted him swapped out with an animal. So they replaced him with a rabbit, then a bear who up until that point had been a minor side character. Later, the Dream team saw an early build of Mario 64 and thought, this looks more fun than what we're doing, let's change Dream into a Mario-style platformer instead. If you haven't pieced it together yet, the bear protagonist was named Banjo, and 16 months later it was released as a little game called Banjo-Kazooie. It's interesting to note, the game actually spent longer in development as Dream than it did as Banjo. Tim Stamper occasionally teases pieces from his collection, and last year he posted this on Twitter.
Arr, so it's true then. The Nintendo 64 treasure does exist after all. Ha 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 ha! It's mine, all mine!
That's Captain Blackeye, leader of the pirate antagonists. He later shows up in Banjo-Tooie, where he complains that a bear stole his glory, as a backhanded nod to Project Dream. Zoom in on Stamper's video and you can see the dev cart says latest version of Dream 64, dated November 96. Supposedly, it's the only copy that still exists. Fans begged him to release it to the public, but he's unlikely to ever do so. He just likes flaunting his treasures. Wall Street was announced in '99 and designed around the DD's internet connection and displayed stock prices updating in real time. Though to be clear, it wasn't software for investing, just a simulation for entertainment. Now some of you all are probably thinking, hurry up and get to the games we actually care about, like Mario and Zelda. That's pretty much exactly what Japanese press said in '99, to which Nintendo president Yamauchi's response was, quote, Wall Street is the 64DD's Mario and Zelda. He called it the disk drive's killer app. Virtually zero info was ever published in English. No one even knows who was making it. We managed to find out in some old Japanese magazines. Turns out it was Recruit Co., who was Nintendo's partner and co-owners in Marigold and Rannet. In one interview we found, RandNet's president said, "When we give away the free demo, people are going to be surprised. Some people will probably get addicted to it. It's a completely new financial simulation game that's very different from menu-based games of the past. It's not just buying stocks and making money, it's in 3D. When I saw it, I was amazed at the graphics. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen before." He went on to say that after the Super Mario Club examined Wall Street, it was their most anticipated DD game. In another interview, RandNet said it was aimed at adults, but gameplay details were always kept secret. Were we going to be pumping, dumping, and bankrupting entire countries? Maybe exploring New York's financial district and completing missions? Unfortunately, it seems we'll never find out, since the disk drive flopped soon after, at which point Wall Street and a ton of other projects got canned. Fans never got to see so much as a single screenshot. Long before it turned into Ocarina of Time, Zelda 64 was announced at Space World 95 and developed specifically for the 64 DD. Miyamoto had big plans for disk's rewritable storage, though he was pretty guarded about the specifics. When pressed for details, he told interviewers, quote, "That part is particularly top secret." One implementation was made public though, the persistent world idea. Link's actions would forever impact Hyrule, with every step in the desert leaving a permanent footprint. A revolutionary achievement for the time, only possible thanks to the DD disk's 38 megabytes of writable storage. Again, Sony memory cards could only store 1/8 of a megabyte, meaning DD games could save 300 times more than PlayStation games. Records from the DD days show locations and characters that didn't make it into the final game, most famously the Triforce Room and the NPC Aria. Another DD difference was that Sage medallions were originally magic medallions, one for fire, wind, darkness, light, and so on, that Link could then combine with arrows. According to game system director Eiji Aonuma, we were going to integrate some actions, some plot threads, and some puzzles making use of those magic medallions, but we came to the conclusion that other already existing items, like fire arrows, could be an equal substitute. A few dungeons changed as well. The Wind Temple became the Forest Temple, and the Ice Temple became the Water Temple. One dungeon got cut entirely, with Aonuma saying, "We originally had 3 temples for young Link to conquer, 3 for adult Link to conquer, and 3 for him to learn a spell in, for a total of 9. But we cut one." Those were mostly typical development cuts, same as any other game. But the real problem was Link's inability to move properly. 3D Systems director Yoshiaki Koizumi made about 500 animations for Link, running, jumping, swinging his sword up, down, etc. On a DD floppy, sometimes it'd take time to load a specific animation. "I can't move my Link on the Nintendo 64 DD, Koizumi complained. Cartridges don't have any moving mechanical parts, but discs do, unfortunately, so they had no choice but to switch development over to the standard N64. At the April 97 Tokyo Game Show, Miyamoto got up on stage and proclaimed Zelda's going to be on cartridge. The audience murmured. "I want to prioritize Link's movements more than the writable storage a disc allows, so we're switching to cartridge. It'll release in the fall." Later, it was revealed Zelda wasn't just coming to a cart, it was a 32 megabyte cart, the biggest ever released at the time. But it was only half the size of a DD disc, and lacked rewritability, so there'd be no persistent world to remember Link's actions, or any of the other features Miyamoto kept secret. The Zelda team kept pouring more and more content into the cart, so much so that the fall 97 release date gradually slipped all the way to November 1998. Miyamoto didn't want to stop, but they needed those holiday sales, and a lot of ideas got axed as a result. Like Kaepora Gaebora having multiple personalities. "We wanted to do that," Miyamoto lamented, but wouldn't have had it ready in time for Christmas. "There were a lot of ideas we couldn't add in, like the hug bed. When Link gets in his bed, it'd suddenly wrap around him. We didn't have enough time to put that in either." He also felt Hyrule was too empty, without much moving around in it, or information to obtain. Ultimately, Miyamoto said he was 90% satisfied with how Ocarina turned out, but with 2 more months he could have hit 100. He also said it'd be cool if the game saved after beating Ganon, letting you explore a Hyrule at peace, but adding a 3rd version of Hyrule would have required 20% more space, which the cartridge just didn't have. After Zelda switched to carts, but before release, Miyamoto drew up a plan. Launch Ocarina of Time near Christmas, then a 64 DD disc later, with ideas he couldn't fit in the cart. The disc was called Ura Zelda, which translates to Another Zelda or Zelda's Flip Side, an expansion set in the same old Hyrule, but different this time. Miyamoto said there'd be new areas and dungeons, and compared it to the New Game Plus in the original Legend of Zelda, where after beating the game, the difficulty increases, dungeons change locations, heart containers, shops, and items are relocated, and so on. Zelda 1's New Game Plus doesn't have a name in-game. English speakers usually call it Second Quest, but in Japan it's often referred to as Ura Zelda. And that's what this new Ura Zelda was going to be, a continuation of that old tradition, but more ambitious. Fan hype was through the roof, with gamers desperate to see how the greatest game of all time could be made even better with a future tech expansion. Miyamoto said there'd be, quote, the random element. Every time you go into a dungeon, the composition will be different. For example, if a treasure chest was in a certain place the first time you entered a dungeon, it won't be there next time, it'll be somewhere else. And though he was explicit that we couldn't build our own dungeons, we would be able to, quote, download new dungeons and share data with other players. He later said potentially hundreds of dungeons. In one particularly mysterious interview, Miyamoto teased, we've already talked about a network Zelda as an interesting idea. The assistance of other players in the network could motivate a player's active participation, instead of the traps or secrets that I create. We asked Giles Goddard, an Ocarina dev who sat next to Miyamoto when he said that, if Nintendo actually worked on that network Zelda.
Instead of the traps or secrets that I create. Do you recall any specifics regarding work on this network Zelda that have never made their way into a finished Zelda game?
Yes.
Okay.
And I want to stay alive, so I'm not going to say what.
It seems whatever those online features were, they're still a tightly held secret. If this all sounds familiar, it's because we did an Ura Zelda deep dive a couple years ago. In today's video, we're covering dozens of games, so you're just getting the Ura cliff notes. If you want every detail, go watch that previous video after this one. But to wrap it up, by the time Ocarina came out a couple years later, Miyamoto had scrapped all those ideas and decided Ura would focus only on the dungeons. But Aonuma didn't want to do that because you couldn't call something like that a, quote, new game, in his opinion. So he and Miyamoto struck a bargain. If his team could make a full game for 64DD in just 1 year, they wouldn't have to do Ura Zelda. And thus, most of the team started a new project called Zelda Gaiden, while a skeleton crew stayed behind to work on Ura. They tried to do more, but in the end, all they got finished was slightly remixing the dungeons. At this point, Ocarina's expansion was completely neutered compared to its original version, and even less ambitious than Zelda 1's Ura. Zelda Gaiden translates to Zelda Side Story, a title Miyamoto liked so much he considered making it the official name of the game. His original idea was a direct sequel set in a peaceful post-Ganon Hyrule, with Link investigating some sort of incident, quote, like a detective game. But Aonuma's team went in a different direction, ultimately leading to Majora's Mask. It's unclear if it was ever planned to take advantage of any of the DD's unique features, like the real-time clock, online connection, or mass rewritable storage. There's a few websites claiming the clock would have been used, which sounds plausible considering Majora's focus on time, and that the game's length was originally 1 week instead of 3 days. Having in-game time reflect real-time makes some intuitive sense, instead of 1 in-game hour passing in under a minute. But we've never seen any primary sources supporting these claims. The only thing we could find was Miyamoto literally mumbling to himself that maybe players would be able to design their own masks with the Game Boy camera and Mario Artist. But according to our 64DD consultant Luigi Blood, the release version had its liblio completely removed. That's the internal library code that manages the 64DD. In other words, any info on DD-specific features got erased. So rumors and mumbling aside, it seems the only part of the disk drive Majora was ever meant to use was the memory expansion pack. A lot of you all remember it as just that thing you had to stick in your N64 to play more Zelda, but originally it was part of the 64DD bundle. Now's probably a good time to explain what that bundle was and how it released. You see, the 64DD was never sold in stores like standard N64s, it was mail order only, and it didn't have a price exactly, more like a subscription. You had to sign up for a 1-year plan paying 2,500 yen a month, equivalent to $23 US, plus a one-time $14 shipping fee. So in total, you're paying $290 USD for the full bundle. In return, you get a 64DD, a mouse, and memory expansion pack along with 7 games, Doshin the Giant, SimCity 64, the F-Zero X expansion kit, and all 4 Mario Artists. You also get the RANnet disc, cable, and modem cartridge for connecting to the internet. So really not a bad deal for under $300. Most of that bundle you get at launch, but some would trickle in over the next few months. After the first year, it cost $14 a month if you wanted to continue your RANnet internet service, for stuff like downloads, online games, and so on. The initial bundle was limited to 100,000 customers, and Nintendo was going to make more after they sold out. Pre-orders opened November 99, deliveries arriving early December. Nintendo expected to sell 500,000 units in the first year, but only 15,000 people bought in. So the DD was deemed a failure. Only 2 more games ever released, Japan Pro Golf Tour 64 and Doshin the Giant, Tinkling Toddler Liberation Front. Both came out in May 2000, priced at $30 each. In October, Nintendo announced RANnet was being discontinued, at which point the disk drive was officially dead. Even the Virtual Boy, an objectively worse piece of hardware, managed to sell more units, get more games, and hold on longer till death. And well, that's pretty much all you need to know about the 64 add-ons distribution. If you want to hear more about the 9 games that did release, GameSack's got a great video covering them all. Check it out when you're done here. But yeah, the memory expansion pack. It doubled memory from 4 megabytes to 8, or in other words, it enabled the game to do more all at once. For Majora's Mask, that mostly came down to NPC movements and animations. That seemed to be the only piece of the 64DD it ever made use of. By early 2000, the disk drive was already on its deathbed, so they released Majora on a cartridge that required the expansion pack as a separate $30 purchase. The game itself cost $60, though it probably would have sold for half that if it stayed on disc. Likewise, Zelda probably would have sold for around $20, since that's what the F-Zero expansion cost if you bought it outside of the bundle. Now turning attention back to Zelda. After the Skeleton Crew finished remixing the dungeons, Nintendo stuck the game in a vault for a few years, not sure what to do with it. They debated putting it on cartridge like they did with Majora, but ultimately they put it on a GameCube disc and made it a pre-order bonus for Wind Waker. Thanks to that, 500,000 fans paid up for pre-orders and made Wind Waker the most pre-ordered game of all time in 2003. In English they called it Master Quest, but in Japanese it's still Zelda. A decade later, when Ocarina came to 3DS, it released with a new version of Zelda, a little closer to the original version.
知る人ぞ知るもう一つの時のオカリナ、通称裏ゼルダ。
It's got remixed dungeons, of course, but enemies also deal double damage, and the entirety of Hyrule is mirrored left to right. The 3DS version also has a boss rush hidden in Link's bed, seemingly a callback to the hug bed Miyamoto wanted to implement all those years ago. The rest of Zelda, with its randomization, downloadable dungeons, and network abilities, all became little more than unused ideas and unfinished programming. Running in real time at Space World 96, Rev Limit was one of the earliest third-party disc games shown publicly. Another 3 years of development, and it was pretty far along, set to become the DD's premier racing title. With the power of the 64DD, players could customize Japanese supercars and tracks and race against friends online. According to Japanese magazines, for folks who were more into tuning than racing, there was also going to be a director mode, letting you be more of a manager and leave the driving itself to a professional. Unfortunately, the game eventually downgraded to a standard N64 cartridge, then canned outright when the devs at Seta ran into financial troubles. Rev Limit was originally planned to release on DD and as an arcade cabinet, kind of like F-Zero AX did years later. But Rev Limit Arcade got cancelled too. A prototype N64 cart from late in development was listed on Yahoo Auctions in 2016 and purchased by Japanese YouTuber Retro Game TV. He uploaded about 10 minutes of video, but even now, 8 years later, hasn't dumped the game so anyone else can play it. Generally speaking, Japanese fans aren't as willing to dump ROMs as their Western counterparts, so unless another copy pops up, DD fans will probably never get to experience Rev Limit for themselves. The next long-lost game on our list is an action-packed rail-shooting homage to Star Fox and Space Harrier. Wait, that's no Lost 64DD game. It's a game you can play right now, and it's the sponsor of today's video, X-Zodiac. Forgive us, its graphics are just too convincing. X-Zodiac's low-poly aesthetic captures that 90s charm, but lets loose with a silky smooth frame rate. Set in the Sanzaru star system, the game's worlds are plagued by an intergalactic terrorist group called Zodiac, and it's your job to take them down. X-Zodiac has 9 main levels, all with major boss battles against terrorist agents, and the devs plan on adding at least 6 more levels in the future. There's also 6 bonus levels, a jamming 16-bit style soundtrack, and of course, barrel rolls. We've had a ton of fun playing X-Zodiac for this video, and we're not alone. It's got overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. X-Zodiac can be yours for just $10 on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Check it out on Steam Early Access using the link in the description below. And if you're feeling generous, consider adding it to your wish list. It really helps indie games like this get discovered by new players. Now, let's get back to the real 64DD games.
All was peaceful until the Dark Riders came and destroyed our village. Many were cut down where they stood, and those who took up arms were slain or dragged away to become slaves, or worse.
If you were alive in the 90s, Diablo is a game that needs no introduction. Blizzard Entertainment's groundbreaking action RPG sold millions on PC, racked up review scores in the 9s and 10s, and is widely considered one of the greatest games of the decade. Diablo kicks off with the protagonist arriving in Tristam, a small town overwhelmed by the forces of evil. The player makes his way through churches, catacombs, caves, and ultimately hell itself to kill the source of the chaos, Diablo. In '97, Nintendo bought the rights to publish the M-rated adventure on their own console, presumably with the disk drive in mind, since RandNet talked about its online multiplayer. When Japanese press said the DD wouldn't have enough games, RandNet president Kayama dismissed their concerns, saying, "I'm not worried. There are people satisfied to play one great game all the time. Some only need Diablo and nothing else. For 64DD, it'll be enough if people see we have at least one title they can't live without." In context, he meant at least one game for different kinds of gamers, and went on to say for others, Wall Street would be the one game for them. But you get the idea. The strategy was quality over quantity. Unfortunately, Diablo never came out, though it's worth noting that Nintendo did publish StarCraft, another PC hit from Blizzard, as an N64 cartridge a year after that interview when the DD was pretty much already dead. A lot of cutscenes and voice acting had to be cut, so it fit on a 32 megabyte cartridge. But Blizzard did make some exclusive content for StarCraft 64, including a secret new story mission, and it would have been awesome if Diablo had gotten the same treatment, especially on the disk drive where so many cuts wouldn't be necessary. Sometimes called the worst game of all time, Superman 64 was originally planned to get a disc expansion after its summer '99 cartridge release. Soup was terrible, but actually sold pretty well, peaking at number 3 on the sales charts. So an expansion made sense financially. The game's developers at Tighe also hoped to launch an expansion for Automobili Lamborghini, which was actually a half-decent game, unlike Superman. According to Tighe, the disc was going to add new tracks, cars, environments, and additional features. They also announced one more game that they were going to release on 64 with later expansion, the action RPG Quest for Camelot, based on the animated movie of the same name. Quest for Camelot 64 and its expansion both got cancelled after the film flopped at the box office and never left early planning stages, though Tighe did still make a Game Boy Color version. It was basically a crappy Zelda clone with review scores averaging 4 out of 10. So even though 3 Tighe discs did get cancelled, we probably didn't miss out on much, if you know what I mean. We've mentioned a few expansions so far, and we've got more coming up, so now's probably a good time to explain how they worked. Most 64DD games were standalone. You just stick the disc in and you're off to the races, but some were expansions like F-Zero. You put the F-Zero X cartridge in the N64 and then insert the disc to add more features to the base game. In F-Zero's case, that meant a dozen more tracks, a car creator, track editor, and the ability to save 100 custom tracks to disk, and combine them into custom cups. Oh, and new music. Check it out. This one's a remix of Mario Kart Rainbow Road. Quite a few expansions were announced, but F-Zero is the only one that ever released. And as of the making of this video, only one more is leaked online, which we'll get to later. One last thing about expansions, they require hooks in the cartridge they're expanding. Hooks are basically lines of code that say this cartridge will get an expansion. What's weird though is that Superman 64 and Automobili Lamborghini don't have any hooks, meaning it would have been impossible to give them expansions. Possibly sometime after announcing Superman and Lambo's expansion, but before the carts came out, Tighe decided to quietly cancel their expansions, then deleted the hooks to save cartridge space. Probably not though, since hooks only take up a few dozen kilobytes, which is basically nothing. It's more likely that Tighe didn't know how expansions worked and were too incompetent to know they needed hooks in the first place. Resident Evil 0. Capcom started planning a Resident Evil prequel right around the time Nintendo announced the 64DD. But after seeing the disk drive's repeated delays and specs, Capcom decided to make it for the N64 instead. We found a fortuitous story in an old Japanese magazine where an interviewer asked Miyamoto why Ocarina of Time's Castle Town has fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds when the rest of the game is behind view in full 3D. Miyamoto explained, "This is a sample of how you can do more on N64. You could call it PR aimed at third parties." Then he laughed and said, "Want to make Resident Evil on it, Mr. Okamoto?" Okamoto's a Capcom producer, and turns out he did end up making a Resident Evil for N64. But after a couple years, the console generation was almost over, so they shifted development over to the GameCube and released in 2002. The 64-bit version had some significant differences, like fast zombies, co-op multiplayer, and of course, the graphics and presentation.
Huh, I see. You're with Stars. You came from that chopper I saw, huh?
Series enthusiasts are dying to play the original, which is theoretically possible since it was at least 20% complete and playable demos were exhibited at the 2000 Tokyo Game Show. Unfortunately, as of this video, no one's come forward with one of those copies to dump online.
If our princess is at the keep, there are 2 ways to get there. The Western Path, or the Northern Passage.
Kaede, I'll go north. You follow them through the other way.
Understand.
Nintendo fans got to play Resident Evil 0 on GameCube, but they weren't so lucky when it came to Onimusha. In '97, Nintendo, Capcom, and Sega combined forces to fund a brand new studio called Flagship, and put Okamoto in charge. When that happened, Okamoto said, "I'm very interested in N64. PlayStation CD-ROM is merely a readable medium. It's obvious that the 64DD's writable feature is very attractive, and this feature will increase the fun of Nintendo games. I want to pursue this particular aspect of development. I don't know if it's possible or not, in regard to technical difficulties, but I have an idea for a ninja version of Resident Evil, in a ninja house full of booby traps and gimmicks." What he's describing later became the first Onimusha, which is essentially a feudal Japan-themed Resident Evil.
Samanosuke, it's really you. Oh, I knew that you would come to save me.
It's got cheese, fixed cameras, tank controls, pre-rendered backgrounds, but instead of cops shooting zombies, it's samurai cutting down demons. A few months after that interview, Okamoto said, quote, "The N64? Of course we're doing it. It's still a secret, but we're starting development on one game for cartridge and one game for 64DD. Please wait and see." The way things turned out, he didn't end up releasing anything on Nintendo 64 or DD. But considering the timeline, those secret projects might have been Resident Evil 0 for N64 or Onimusha for DD. Over the next few years, Okamoto's Flagship made quite a few games for other Nintendo systems, like Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons, Four Swords, Minish Cap, and also worked on Resident Evil 4 and a few Kirby games. There's some conflicting accounts among different devs, but for whatever reason, Flagship started developing Onimusha for PlayStation, then upgraded to release on PS2 with an eventual port to Xbox and even PC in some regions, but never N64, DD, or GameCube. To this day, it's unknown exactly how Okamoto wanted to use the DD's read-write capabilities. Regardless, Onimusha went on to score 8s, 9s, and 10s, which naturally led to sequels and spin-offs. And though it'd be little solace for Nintendo fans back in the day, the original Onimusha did get remastered for Switch. So, if you're a Nintendo-only gamer, you can finally play it, but without the DD features Okamoto was so passionate about. Pokemon Stadium is a game that doesn't need to exist. Stadium's intro cutscene even calls itself POS version 1.0, and they ain't lying. We jest, but remember how upset fans got when Sword and Shield only had 400 Pokemon? Well, imagine a game with only 40 Pokemon. Stadium was originally announced as a launch title for the 64DD. In fact, previews show it fully playable in early '98. With a DD disc 64 megabytes, you could fit tons of data, and originally it was promoted as a sort of Pokemon bank. Trade your Game Boy monsters over and save them to disk. There's more than enough space to store them all. But the DD kept getting delayed, 5 times actually, and they were worried the Pokemon fad wasn't going to last forever. So Stadium got downgraded to regular old N64 onto a cartridge with just 40 Pokemon and only capable of banking 120. Stadium was content poor, and beyond the novelty of seeing a few dozen 3D Pokemon models, it didn't serve much purpose, which is why it never left Japan.
What? Unbelievable!
Some of y'all are probably thinking, I'm sure I played Stadium as a kid, what are you talking about, it never left Japan? Well, the game you played was actually Pokemon Stadium 2, but outside Japan, it was just called Pokemon Stadium. You played the second game. It's what the original disc game should have been, with 151 Pokemon, storage for 240 mons, minigames, and more. Stadium 2 was initially supposed to be a disc 2, actually. It was planned as an expansion, not a sequel. But by 1999, there was less and less reason for the N64DD to even exist. When Nintendo first dreamed it up, the 64 megabyte disc format had a lot of promise, because early in the console generation, they didn't know how to squeeze much storage onto a cartridge. Super Mario 64, for example, was only 8 megabytes. A couple years later, Pokemon Stadium was on a 16 megabyte cartridge. By the time Stadium 2 rolled around, they'd figured out how to fit 32 megabytes, and eventually all the way up to 64 megabytes. So as the add-on kept getting delayed further into the future, it became less and less relevant. Fun fact, to fit all 251 Pokemon, the next Stadium was one of only 3 games ever released on a 64 megabyte cartridge. It's Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver in Japan, but overseas they called it Pokemon Stadium 2, even though Pokemon Stadium 1 is really Stadium 2. A little confusing, but it's worth noting that Stadium 2's code supports a DD expansion of its own, which suggests Stadium Gold and Silver might have been intended as that expansion, which would mean all 3 stadiums were originally meant for 64DD before switching to cartridge. Fire Emblem Maiden of Darkness, also known as Fire Emblem 64, would have been the series' 6th entry. According to Miyamoto, progress was steady and on track for a late '98 launch. Only one screenshot was ever made public, years later in the Japan-only Fire Emblem 25th Anniversary book. The game would have been 3/4 view, as you might expect, visually a middle ground between the SNES and GameCube Fire Emblems. The Japanese book also includes some art for unused characters, like Tighe, Lynette, Helen, Idun, and a few characters without names. The protagonist would have been Roy, who actually got into Smash Bros. Melee despite his debut in Fire Emblem 64 being cancelled. Roy got repurposed for future Fire Emblem games, but Fire Emblem 64's absence left him in the awkward position of fighting in Smash Bros. Before he appeared in his own franchise. Fire Emblem series creator Shozu Kaga said Fire Emblem 64 was too ambitious, then resigned from the company in autumn 2000, with the game publicly scrapped soon after. The next Fire Emblem actually released on SNES, an unusual step backwards considering the N64 was over 3 years old by then. Some elements of Fire Emblem 64 made it into later games, like the Binding Blade, but for the most part, all work on the DD game got thrown out. No ROM or even footage of Fire Emblem 64 has ever leaked online, but that Japanese book did include a page of in-game dialogue. We'll flash it up on screen if you want to read it. Consumers don't need to buy personal computers, they can get a 64DD instead. That was Nintendo's thinking when they teamed up with computer memory manufacturer Hagiwara Syscom, electronic makers DAT Japan and Tokyo Electron, and Fujifilm Co. to make Mario no Photopea. It's basically Photoshop wearing Mario as a skin suit, but even worse than it sounds, as Nintendo themselves didn't do much of the development. It released on cartridge in '98, and what a cartridge it was, just look at it. The slots on top are for smart media cards, so you could import photos from a 90s era digital camera. It was only released in Japan, so we've been showing you a fan translation, otherwise you'd have no idea what you're looking at. Nintendo announced a disc expansion would follow 6 months later to make use of the writable storage, basically just to let you save more pictures. Fast forward 6 months and the 64DD still wasn't out yet, and Mario no Photopea's expansion was never heard from again. Despite immense popularity in the 80s and 90s, the Far East of Eden RPG series has mostly stayed region-locked in Japan. Only one entry was ever localized in English, and that was a fighting game spin-off on Neo Geo. Not long after, Hudson Soft announced a return to the turn-based format with Far East of Eden Oriental Blue for 64DD. But thanks to the add-ons delays and eventually piss-poor sales, Oriental Blue found itself quietly cancelled. In 2003, a game with the same name released on Game Boy Advance in Japan. In short, it's set in a world where Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, and Thailand-inspired cultures coexist, and the hero, he or she, your choice, has to restore peace after a spirit-stealing orb corrupts a nearby castle town. It mostly scored 8 out of 10s, and got enough love for admirers to craft an English fan translation. But according to its director, the GBA game was nothing like the earlier Disk Drive project, after they had gone back to the drawing board and had to, quote, start over from scratch. The original was canned, as far as we can tell, before a single screenshot or any details were ever released aside from the title itself. And thus, Far East of Eden Oriental Blue remains one of the Disk Drive's most enigmatic RPGs, which probably would have turned out pretty good. We keep saying games got cancelled or downgraded to cart because of the DD's repeated delays. But why was it delayed? The original N64 launched in June '96 with 3 games, Mario, Shogi, and Pilot Wings. The Disk Drive wasn't delayed because Nintendo couldn't figure out the hardware. As a matter of fact, it was finished in May '97 and announced to release at the end of the year. According to Miyamoto, there'd be 5 launch titles: Pokemon Stadium, Mother 3, SimCity 64, Mario Artist, and 1 game they were keeping secret. That's a pretty good lineup. Unfortunately, Mother 3, which was promoted as the must-haviest of the 5, fell into development hell. Mario Artist wasn't ready either, and wouldn't be for over a year. And we're not sure what secret game Miyamoto was teasing, but it doesn't appear it was ever finished. So all they really had for launch was SimCity and a half-assed Pokemon Stadium, and thus nothing system-defining like Mario had been to the core console. So Nintendo pushed back the Disk Drive's release a few months to March 1998, but the situation didn't improve, so they pushed it back again, to June '98, then late '98, then June '99, and finally a 5th and final delay to December 1999. At this point, third-party studios had lost enthusiasm for the add-on, and PlayStation 2 was only 3 months away. Nintendo knew they were screwed. Maybe if Mother 3 had been done on time, or Super Mario 64 2, or Zelda, if anything of substance was ready in '97 or '98, the Disk Drive could have taken off. But they just couldn't put together a good launch lineup till it was too late, and that's why the 64DD was dead on arrival. Tonic Trouble was a 3D platformer sharing a lot of DNA with Rayman 2. Same concept creator, composer, same voice actor for the lead, and both released by Ubisoft in 1999. Tonic Trouble came out first though, starring an alien named Ed who accidentally spills some troublesome tonic on Earth, mutating the entire planet. Then he's got to return things back to normal. That's basically the plot. Gameplay-wise, it's a pretty typical 90s platformer. It's not on Wikipedia's big 64DD list, but Ubisoft did acquire a DD dev kit and said Tonic would get a disc expansion, possibly to include a 4-player split-screen co-op. but they ended up scrapping it before the cartridge was even out yet because of, you guessed it, Ubisoft's frustration with the DD's constant delays. The cartridge release was later panned by critics who gave it mostly 5s, though the game still managed to sell over 1 million copies despite the weak reviews. A sequel was briefly in the works, but that fizzled out too, ultimately leaving Ed's legacy as little more than Rayman's forgotten little brother. One of the more unique concepts from a third party was Super Real Island, also known as Desert Island 64. Its story would have seen you shipwrecked on a deserted island with no knowledge of the native inhabitants or wildlife. You'd farm, raise livestock, fight off predators, and build a civilization from scratch. As the island grows, life evolves, friendly and unfriendly, so the players got to bring nature to heel. Sounds like a cool idea, but apparently it wasn't very impressive in practice. The game reportedly only reached 20% completion. Then the developers at Imagineer pitched gameplay to European publishers, none of which were interested. Imagineer is best known for making Quest 64, fondly remembered by some as the first RPG for N64, 2 years into its life cycle. But Quest 64's review scores averaged about 5 out of 10. Desert Island 64 probably wasn't going to fare much better, and even magazine writers at the time said it would probably end up as a shipwreck of a game. That same team at Imagineer worked on another game tentatively titled Soul. Soul was an RPG in the quote, traditional Japanese adventure style that would have had you exploring towns and landscapes and prioritize story and depth over graphics. No other info or images were ever made public, so it seems this project didn't get too far along either. Imagineer did manage to release Big Mountain 2000 though. Big Mountain 2000! They announced the skiing and snowboarding game was to be developed for 64DD, but just 6 months later, it was already out on cartridge. It only had 4 stages, and even Nintendo Power, who was typically generous to games on their own systems, only scored it in the 5s. IGN thought a disc version would provide better resolution and texture variety, but that didn't end up happening. Imagineer wasn't exactly an A or even B tier studio, so rather than dwell on Big Mountain 2000, we'll go ahead and skip ahead too. Dragon Quest is a massive franchise, bigger even than Final Fantasy. The first 6 Dragon Quests were exclusive to Nintendo consoles, and the 7th was slated for the 64 disk drive. A turn-based RPG that begins with your father bringing home a map he found on a fishing trip. It shows a world filled with continents, but the world in their time is just a small island in a vast ocean. The player and his growing party travel back in time to when those continents were still around. But they are facing crises threatening their survival, and only by resolving their problems can the continents reappear in the present. Dragon Quest VII was announced in 1996, but a year later Enix announced they were jumping ship and releasing on PlayStation instead. It's hard to overstate how big a blow this was for Nintendo. The game ended up going quadruple platinum in Japan alone, a huge win for PlayStation that only cast more doubt on Nintendo's position in the industry. And what made it even worse was how deprived of RPGs Nintendo fans outside of Japan were at the time. Truly a dark day, not just for the disc drive, but even the base N64. After all was said and done, when the console war subsided, Nintendo had lost to Sony by a 3-1 margin. Fumbling Dragon Quest played no small part in that defeat. Taking advantage of the DD's internet functionality, Rannet discussed 3, guess you could call them, live service games. The first was tentatively titled My Horse Racing Magazine, which they said would partially go live the same month the DD launched. Quote, you'll become a fictional horse owner and participate in imaginary tournaments while getting the latest horse racing news and information, in an entirely new type of online game. It sounds kind of like fantasy football, where you design a fantasy team, then what happens in a real-life NFL season dictates your team's performance, so winning largely comes down to strategizing and staying on top of the news. Rannet also said they were planning a digital baseball magazine and digital Formula 1 magazine, which would essentially be the same concept, but for baseball and racing. Users would have had to pay subscriptions for all 3 games. Before we get to more games, let's quickly examine the 64DD online strategy. There were some netplay games, but Nintendo was more focused on functionality that didn't require high-speed internet. Part of their plan was basically an eShop selling smaller DD games, plus a small library of NES, SNES, and Game Boy titles. For bigger DD games, you could watch gameplay videos and pay through your DD, and then they'd send you a physical copy via mail. Every game would also have basically its own subreddit within RandNet, so you could suggest future expansions to the devs or just chit-chat with your fellow fans. Another example was the F-Zero page would have a time trial contest. Gamers could also produce their own content, like selling guides and tips and tricks collections for $1 or $2. This is a change from the old system of feudalism, where game companies unilaterally sold software to gamers, explained RandNet president Kayama. It's a kind of democracy. If you want to make money making games in the future, the 64DD is a must-buy. He also alluded to users making in-game content, but the DD died before any of that came to be.
Round 1, fight!
It's easy to forget how dominant Street Fighter was back in the 90s. Street Fighter II was one of Super Nintendo's top 10 bestsellers. In fact, it was 2 of the top 10, only beaten out by Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong. So when fans heard Street Fighter III was coming to 64DD, it was a big deal. Developer Capcom got a disk drive development kit in '97, which was earlier than most other studios, and IGN told its readers to expect Street Fighter as a DD launch title. It never ended up arriving at all, unfortunately, and it took the arcade hit a few years to make it to any console, till finally landing on Dreamcast to rave reviews.
Put your hands together if you wanna clap as we take you through this monkey rap.
As soon as Rare finished up the Donkey Kong Country trilogy on SNES, they immediately got to work on a 64 follow-up. It spent the first year and a half not as a 3D game, but as a side-on adventure. If you've read up on the game's history, you might have heard it referred to as 2.5D. That's really a misnomer though, it was side-on, not a side-scroller. For example, Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze were 2.5D side-scrollers, and direct continuations of the SNES trilogy. But Donkey Kong 64 was not a country game, it actually played more like early builds of Banjo-Kazooie, which looked like this. We talked to Rare artist Carl Tilley, who compared its smaller, more linear stages to Crash Bandicoot. The design was more like side-on Crash, with levels that you play once, he said. I can't remember if we even had many or any collectibles in it at that point either, but eventually we realized the design was lacking and it had no replay value. After Mario 64, free-roaming 3D platformers were seen as the way of the future, so Rare broke up the DK team and brought in some Banjo-Kazooie guys who turned Donkey Kong into another free-roamer. The side-on prototype never got shown to the public, but we've been told some NDAs are expiring soon and screenshots will make their way online probably later this year. Ultra Donkey Kong is on Wikipedia's big list of announced but cancelled disc games, and strangely, it also says the 64DD itself was canned. None of that appears to be true though. For starters, Ultra Donkey Kong was just one of several names made up by the press, derived from the fact that the N64 was originally called the Ultra 64. As for being on DD, sites like GameSpot reported that in '97, saying they heard it from Japanese press. Japanese magazines did have it tagged as a DD game, but in the actual text, they would say things like, will the N64 version be a traditional side-scrolling action game, or an RPG taking advantage of the 64DD's features? They didn't really know anything, because DK64 wasn't even officially mentioned till a year later, and wasn't properly revealed till 6 months after that. It wasn't announced for DD and never developed for it either. Tilley was on the team before and after the breakup, and he told us the game didn't have any specific designs to make use of the 64DD in pre-production, and Rare management wouldn't have wanted to release on the DD. Hardware sales dictated where best to sell the game. In other words, even if DD sales did meet Nintendo's expectations, it only would have sold 1/10 as much as the base console. So even in the best scenario, it never would have made financial sense for Rare to release Donkey Kong 64 on disc. We talked to a couple other devs, who don't recall it ever being meant for DD either. Since we're contradicting common belief, we wanted to be extra certain of this debunking, so we ran this all past DK Vine, a superfan site covering the series since 1999. They were adamant that it was all just rumors and said none of their contact or sources have any memory of it ever being for 64DD. So it is disappointing to find out Nintendo mascots like Donkey Kong, Kirby 64, and Yoshi's Story were never actually disc games despite their inclusion on every DD games list on the internet. It certainly makes the disc drive lose some of its luster. But there's still lots of games that were real, and made clever use of the hardware's unique features, like... Mother 1 and 2 were never huge sellers, but they attracted cult followings with their quirkiness and unique sense of humor. Mother 3, also known as Earthbound 64, was one of the disk system's most promising projects. Unfortunately, it also had one of the most troubled developments. In 1992, series creator Shigesato Itoi said he was making Mother 3 with a Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on. When that add-on got cancelled, development moved over to a standard SNES cart, then later moved over to N64, then to the 64DD, then back to the N64, until ultimately landing on Game Boy Advance in 2006, some 14 years after the project began. It's hard to even say what the game was, since it took so many different forms, so for the sake of brevity, we'll mostly focus on the 64 and DD versions. The team was made up of Itoi's Ape Inc., Iwata's HAL Labs, and even some Pokemon devs. Their plans were ambitious and would have made full use of the disk drive's unique features. Mother 3 was divided into 12 chapters, each with a different protagonist, some adults, some kids, and some non-human. Probably the most recognizable was Lucas, thanks to his role in the Smash Bros. Series. All 12 protagonists live in different places and different times with different motivations. The one thing they do share is all their worlds have a chimera forest, which supernaturally connects all of their disparate strands together. Here's the story from the Space World 99 official guidebook. Quote, "The main characters are a family of 4 with a dog living in a peaceful village. One day, after an unidentified object appears in a nearby cove, strange events start occurring in the village. Then, from the depths of the forest, an unsettling, terrifying scream can be heard. What's happening in those woods? To protect the forest, the village, and his beloved family, the Father Flint ventures into the trees. Here's a strange world that you can't quite decipher between the Middle Ages or the Old West, Tighe explained. And in the end, you realize the circumstances of what made it so strange. It was made in a way that you'd be thinking, this is weird. Then you make it through Chapter 11, and hit Chapter 12 and scream. Iwata said the 64DD's read-write function was a core theme of Mother 3, letting every player make their own unique impacts on the game world, similar to Zelda 64. He explained that in other games, if you rearrange a room, then leave and come back, it'd be restored to its default state. Any changes you made were gone. But on 64DD, everything would be remembered, making it feel more real, like it was your own. That concept wouldn't just apply to your room, but the entire game. NPCs would remember past conversations so they wouldn't repeat themselves, for example. And thanks to the DD's internal clock, you could do stuff like sow seeds, and 3 real-life days later, they'd sprout. All the DD features were working in unison to make something special. But eventually the disk drive's future started looking bleak, so development switched back to cartridge, which meant losing all those DD features and slimming down the story to only 9 chapters. At one point, the N64 version was roughly half done with a release date in May 2000, but after missing the deadline, Tighe announced Mother 3 was officially cancelled. The big game, once announced as a DD launch title, now wasn't coming out at all. But the story doesn't end there. A few years later, development picked back up on the GBA, with the game finally releasing in 2006 to reviews in the high 8s. Much of the story remained intact, but it got cut down even shorter. Originally it was 12 chapters taking place over a 10-year timeline, but just 8 chapters on GBA, spread over 3 years. The game famously never left Japan, but it didn't take long for fans to put together a high-quality translation of their own. Citing IGN, Wikipedia says after the game got downgraded to N64, there was an expansion disc in the works to add more content called Mother 3.5. Superfan Okeji Dragon asked a Mother designer if that was true in 2011, but he threw cold water on it, saying an expansion might have been an idea at some point, maybe, but they didn't put any actual work into it. And sadly, they never made a Mother 4. Series fans and DD enthusiasts have long dreamed of Mother 3 leaking online, but so far, no such luck. It's unknown how many copies even exist. Fans are aware of one copy in the hands of developer Brownie Brown, but lament there are no other leads to follow. We talked to some former Nintendo of America employees like localizer Jim Warnell, who said some copies came through there too.
We saw quite a few games that would come in for like early demo evaluation. I know we saw early versions of Mother 3. What I saw was just a really rough demo. I think it was the 3 to 4 main characters. From what I saw, it was really rough.
So instead of Japan, the superfans sniffing around for protocards might have more luck talking to devs on this side of the pond. If a build ever does leak, it might come from old NOA staffers. But after all these years, odds seem slim. Earthbound 64 might be the holy grail that forever remains buried, never to be found. Desmond 3D is a game builder for making your own space shooters. Shoot 'em ups. You know, shmups. Similar to Mario Artist and the F-Zero X expansion, this was another one of those build-your-own Disneyland titles that Miyamoto was so enthusiastic about, and ultimately led to games like Mario Maker. Desmond's all about customization, designing your own ships, enemies, stages, and even music. It also comes with tutorials and some pre-built stages so you can understand what Desmond makes possible. You can build entire campaigns, all with mouse support. A cartridge version released in '98 is a Japan exclusive, and was later supposed to get a DD expansion. The cartridge actually contains a hidden message, thanking the debuggers and saying, quote, "We all sincerely hope the 64DD will be released as soon as possible." Little did they know, they still had another year and a half of delays ahead. The unreleased expansion would have used rewritable storage to let you save more levels, 3D models, textures, animations, and music than what was possible on a cartridge, basically by a factor of 10. You could even save multiple campaigns, all on one disc. A shmup editor is a niche product for sure, but back in the 90s, it would have been mind-blowing for the right kind of gamer. About a decade ago, the DD expansion disc was acquired and dumped online by a collector called Willis82. You can play it right now if you like, but you won't have much fun if you can't speak Japanese.
I think I singed my hair. All right, easy.
After Mission Impossible set theaters ablaze in summer '96, a video game adaptation was hot on its heels. Originally intended for 16-bit systems, including Super Nintendo, publisher Ocean Software eventually shifted development over to N64. It was announced before the console was even out yet, along with an expansion planned for the 64DD. The disc would add new levels and take multiplayer online. but Ocean was having trouble settling into the 3D era. Early screenshots were too good to be true. Getting those graphics running on anything but PC was literally an impossible mission. And after a year and a half, the team could only get the game running at 4 frames a second. Development hell is probably a fair way to describe it, but we'll keep things short and just say a new team was put in charge, and after some delays, they finally managed to get it to market in 1998, squeezed onto a 12 megabyte cartridge. Those early plans for a disc expansion never came to fruition, with the devs saying, quote, "We haven't had the time to really think about it." And at that point, they were working up to 20 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they didn't even have time to implement multiplayer at all, let alone a deathmatch. A self-described spy simulator, the short campaign followed the same basic premise as the blockbuster film, but plot-wise branched off into new territory. Mission Impossible may have never found its way to DD or measured up to the high expectations set by GoldenEye for that matter, but thanks to the devs' Herculean efforts, the cartridge release turned out to be a decent success, reviewing in the 7s and selling well over 1 million copies, which was pretty good back then.
Tamagotchi, the original virtual reality pet. Your care determines the pets you get from Bandai.
In 1996, Bandai released Tamagotchi into the wild, selling tens of millions. In 97, they quickly followed up with a couple of Tamagotchi Game Boy games, then one on N64 called 64 de Haken. Tamagotchi Mina de Tamagotchi World. It's a board game pretty similar to Mario Party, with occasional mini-games and up to 4 players. We stumbled over a 97 interview where Nintendo executive Hiroshi Imanishi announced that not only was Fire Emblem coming to DD, but that Nintendo and Bandai were also in talks to make a Tamagotchi disc game. Quote, "We're discussing if we can do something interesting on 64DD. Presumably, it would have been more of a virtual pet experience than another board game. But since we were unable to find any more info online or in print, we can't say for sure, and don't know if it entered production or just fizzled out in negotiations." Paper Mario was announced as a DD exclusive in early 97. Originally, it was conceived as a sequel to Super Mario RPG, which had been developed by Square. The sequel was initially called Super Mario RPG 2, and naturally Nintendo asked Square to make this one as well. But Square turned them down because they already had their hands full making Final Fantasy VII. So they hired HAL Labs, the guys who made Earthbound. Then eventually the project landed in the laps of Intelligent Systems, at the time best known for the Fire Emblem franchise. Understandably, them picking up where Square left off was pretty controversial, and a lot of fans didn't think they were up to the task. They'd never made a 3D game before, unless you want to count Fire Emblem 64, which as we said got cancelled because they couldn't hack it. Intelligent Systems buckled down though and separated themselves from Square's offering with a brand new 2.5D aesthetic. By the end, it was no longer a sequel to Mario RPG, not in name, story, or even tone. The name changed to Paper Mario and finally released in late 2000 near the end of the N64's lifecycle, as a cartridge. Everyone loved it, but it only sold about half as many copies as the previous game, making it hard not to wonder how Super Mario RPG 2 might have turned out on disc, especially if Square had stayed in charge. New Japan Pro Wrestling Tokon Road Brave Spirits. Heck of a name. As you might have deduced from the title, it's a Japanese wrestling game that never reached foreign shores. It's based on the real-life New Japan Pro Wrestling League, which was founded in the 70s and still going strong to this day. Tokon Road came out on a cartridge in early 98 with a voiceover recorded at actual matches and a more sophisticated combat system than you typically experience in a wrestling game. Or so they say. Sorry, I'm playing as the red guy here, I don't know the button combinations. The game was a moderate success, and the DD expansion was planned to release in quick succession with more characters, rings, audio, and so on. Wikipedia thinks it got cancelled, but actually it got reworked into a standalone sequel, New Japan Pro Wrestling Tokon Road 2, The Next Generation, which came out less than a year after the first game. Again, only in Japan, but this time on a cartridge almost 3 times the size. Not much else to say about this one, so let's skip ahead to Back in the 90s, Ted Woolsey was a pretty famous localizer who translated games like Mario RPG, Final Fantasy VI, and Chrono Trigger. In 96, he left Square to found his own company called Big Rain, which was quickly bought out by publisher Crave Entertainment, where he stayed on as producer. At this point, Ted started producing 2 RPGs. One was Shadow Madness for PlayStation, which reviewed decently but sold below expectations. The other was for 64DD and codenamed Project Cairo, which Crave said would take full advantage of the hardware. "If it was another anime RPG, I don't think we'd be making it," said Crave. "We think the art in the game is as good, if not better, than that in Final Fantasy VII. Crave was in contract negotiations to base the game on a major comic book IP, though which one exactly was always kept secret. Cairo was on track to be pretty good considering Woolsey's pedigree, but it ended up getting cancelled before so much as a screenshot was ever published, and more details like which comic book it was based on always remained elusive. We emailed Ted but never heard back. Then we reached out to a couple dozen devs under his producership, and only got replies from 2 of them. Neither could remember dang near anything from almost 30 years ago. So unfortunately, Project Cairo endures as a big question mark. If any of you all watching this have any leads or worked on it yourself, our Twitter DMs and email are wide open. On the record, off the record, on background, anonymous, however you want to talk, we'll oblige. Though not as well known as it used to be, the Ogre Battle series has one hell of a pedigree. Starting in '93 on the Super Nintendo, you might think it looks a lot like Final Fantasy Tactics, but actually it's the other way around. Ogre came out first, then its creator left Quest Corporation for Squaresoft, and made Tactics as a spiritual successor. When that happened, Quest ventured out to make an Ogre sequel without him. There's some question online if it was ever actually intended for Nintendo's disk drive, but we managed to find confirmation in an issue of 64 Dream. Quote, Quest has announced they're developing an RPG exclusively for 64DD. We still don't know if the 64DD will sell or not, but the discerning Quest is going for it. Well, maybe they weren't that discerning. The DD did end up a failure after all. But Quest needed the extra storage only a disc could offer. Like many other DD games, the hardware's repeated delays ultimately pushed them into a standard N64 release, this time onto a 40 megabyte cartridge, which made it the biggest N64 game ever released at the time. And even on card, it managed to be one of the longest, fighting your way through 50 hours of Civil War with 3 possible endings. Ogre Battle was published by Nintendo and finally released in '99, proving Quest still had the magic even after losing its creator. The game pulled in 9s like it was nothing, and is still considered one of the best real-time tactical RPGs of all time. Interestingly, the Nintendo GigaLeak revealed the cartridge was coded to get a disc expansion until pretty late in development, meaning after it was downgraded to cart, Quest was still planning an additional disc. But code support was deleted prior to release, so the expansion never came out. We're going to talk about Pokemon RPG here in a minute, but for full context, first you need some backstory on Pokemon Snap. It all started in early 1995, a year before the first Pokemon Game Boy games released in Japan. Miyamoto, Iwata, and Tighe were talking about how rough devs had it at other companies, getting overworked just to crank out crap games. So they went to Nintendo president Yamauchi and said, why don't we hire some of these guys and give them complete freedom to make whatever they want for 64DD, with no deadlines. Surely they'll cook up something incredible. Yamauchi was an open-minded guy, so he said, yeah, let's do it. They named the new studio Jack and Beans and put out an ad calling all developers. It said, talent is like a seed. Water properly, it'll sprout and grow as high as the heavens. But some seeds are neglected, buried, and can't grow. What a waste. Come with us, little seeds. We'll give you soil and water. Nintendo's new 64-bit machine awaits. Then it revealed Jack and Beans was led by legends like Miyamoto, Iwata, and Tighe. 550 devs showed up, and Nintendo picked the best 11. They were all elated to have gotten picked. But when they arrived for their first day of work, they were surprised to find their new office was tiny with hardly anything in it. Until recently, it had been Nintendo's ping pong room. Iwata handed them an envelope stuffed with cash. Here's $4,000, he said. Miyamoto told them, make something that's never been done before. And they left. The big guys were thinking, oh man, I wish we had it this good when we were young. No managers breathing down our necks, no deadlines, total freedom. But in reality, those 11 devs were terrified. They didn't know how to make something never done before. They spent the $4,000 on a TV, refrigerator, and some cabinets. There was minimal leadership from the big guys. They were too busy with other projects like Cabbage, Mother, and Mario. No one was put in charge, so the Jack guys wandered aimlessly for months till they eventually started making a game about taking pictures. That was an original idea, they thought. And DD discs have lots of writable storage which could be used for saving tons of pictures. Wikipedia and other sites say at this point the game was literally based on Jack and the Beanstalk, but actually that was just the inspirational recruitment ad. Truth is, it doesn't seem like the game had much of a plot, or even a name. Even the guys making it thought it sucked. There wasn't any motivation for the player to take pictures or any rewards for doing so. They scrapped it and restarted several times, and even after all that, the team said it didn't even feel like a game. After a couple of years, Pokemon was exploding in popularity, and the anime had just debuted. So Nintendo mixed things up by making Pokemon the thing players take pictures of. Some of the Jack guys didn't like that idea, but it ultimately gave them some direction. Originally, the player wandered around on foot, but after experimenting with an on-rail system in certain areas, Miyamoto told them to make the entire game on rails. They also added Professor Oak, who grades your pictures and gives you points, thus providing a sense of progression. The third game changer was letting players print out their pictures and share them with friends, which got fans connecting in real life, similar to the Pokemon Game Boy games. The team finally felt like they had a game on their hands. Late in development, it switched from disc to cart because they wanted to release it to line up with the first Pokemon movie. And also so they could launch before Gold and Silver came out, otherwise it'd make Snap look bad for not including any Gen 2 Pokemon. One of the main selling points in previews was being able to save all of your photos. In fact, disc's writable storage was why they made the camera game in the first place. But after switching to cart, there was only enough storage to save 60 photos, not even enough for one picture of each Pokemon, which sort of undermined the game's original premise. Not to mention it only had 6 levels. Start to finish, the whole process lasted over 4 years and really soured Nintendo's belief in giving devs total freedom and no deadlines. Fortunately, things turned out okay. Pokemon Snap finally released in spring '99 to decent reviews and a few million sales. Not a lot by Pokemon standards, but enough to keep the lights on in the ping pong room. That was a pretty long history on Pokemon Snap, but it was necessary context to better understand another game on Wikipedia's canceled disc games list, Pokemon RPG. In '98, IGN reported a game codenamed Pokemon DD was in development, and speculated it played like the Game Boy games. That speculation got spread as fact by folks like Lost Media Wiki, who said it was going to be the series' first console RPG. As we've already discussed, websites like IGN got a lot of their information from Japanese magazines. Digging through them now, we found those magazines were talking about a Pokemon RPG for DD back then. They don't have many details, though there was plenty of speculation, like maybe it'd come out as multiple colors like the Game Boy games. Or there'll be additional discs that add more forests and towns, which sounds awesome, but we couldn't find any statements from Nintendo backing any of that up. We did find an interesting interview from Miyamoto though, in summer '97. When asked about Pokemon coming to the disc drive, he says, "For now, we plan to release 2 kinds of Pokemon game. One will be an entirely different genre from an RPG. That one will release first." The interviewer asks when. He says it'll be a DD launch title, but can't give away any details until the next Space World. With what we know now in the future, Miyamoto was clearly referring to Pokemon Stadium. Next, the interviewer asks, "And what's the state of the other one, the Pokemon RPG?" Miyamoto, "Well, right now, we currently have 10 staff members working on the Pokemon RPG, but we plan to add another 20 people soon." End quote. This interview took place about 2 months after Jack and Bean's camera game was transformed into Pokemon Snap. At the time, you could run around freely, and what the game was exactly was constantly in flux. So it's understandable that when the interviewer called it an RPG, Miyamoto didn't say boo, especially since he didn't want to spill the beans until Space World. More revealing is when he said the RPG has 10 staff members. We know the Jack team was 11 guys, and 1 quit in the middle due to the troubled development. That makes 10. Miyamoto also says they're going to add 20 more. Pokemon Snap's credits, if you subtract the producers, localizers, and voice actors, and just account for the core team, shows a staff of 34. The math all adds up. The RPG was Pokemon Snap. After Snap officially revealed, Pokemon RPG was replaced with Pokemon Snap on Japanese magazine's upcoming game lists, with its genre switched from RPG to ETC. Meanwhile, in the English-speaking world, IGN kept on reporting that Stadium, Snap, and Pokemon RPG were all different projects. But Miyamoto said there were 2 DD games in development, not 3. Nintendo said that all along, even before the Miyamoto interview. 2 3D Pokemon games for 64 DD, which were revealed as Stadium and Snap in early '98. But before their official titles were revealed, both were referred to as Pokemon 64 and Pokemon DD interchangeably, which confused 90s journalists. There was also a 3rd game, Hey You Pikachu for N64, confusing things even worse. For about a year, Nintendo was constantly teasing these games to build up hype and sell consoles, while trying not to reveal too much before their official reveals. Even for us, with the benefits of hindsight and modern internet, sorting through all this mess was still confusing as hell. But after translating hundreds of pages of Pokemon primary sources over the past few years, it's clear that Pokemon RPG was born from vague statements about multiple titles and combined into one imaginary game fans wanted to exist. Did you know gaming's not innocent in all this either? We spread the Pokemon RPG rumor too in a video 5 years ago.
In a 1998 IGN article, the site listed 4 upcoming Pokemon N64 games: Pokemon RPG, Hey You Pikachu, Pokemon Snap, and Pokemon Stadium, implying Pokemon RPG was an entirely different game than Stadium, despite both being turn-based. It's thought the game would have been in line with the main Pokemon series, but for home consoles. The only first-hand mention of it was in a 1997 interview with Miyamoto, conducted by Electronic Gaming Monthly. When asked about the game's progress, he said 10 people were currently working on the game, and that while it was planned to come out in Japan, a US release was still up in the air.
Miyamoto was actually talking about Stadium 1 in that interview, which was indeed slated as a DD launch title at the time, and only came out in Japan. That's our bad. We should have dug deeper into primary sources back then instead of repeating surface-level internet info. Our sincerest apologies. We could spend another 10 minutes dissecting interviews and connecting dots, but I think we've made our point. To wrap all this up, Wikipedia says there are 5 cancelled DD Pokemon games. The Stadium expansion disc and Stadium 2 are the same thing though, so we'll cross one off the list. And we're going to cross Pokemon RPG off too. There were only 3 DD Pokemon games, plus 1 more if you count Stadium Gold and Silver, all of which released on cartridge. Okay, with all of that debunked, let's move on to some games that did exist. Super Robot Wars 64 is set 200 years after a population crisis that pushed most of humanity fleeing to space. The ruling class stayed planetside to govern the space colonies but grew ever more oppressive with the passage of time. Eventually, Earth and the colonies went to war, resulting in half the underclass getting wiped out. But in the ashes of their conflict, an alien empire shows up to conquer what's left. The player takes control of resistance fighters. That's the story. Gameplay-wise, it's a grid-based strategy RPG similar to Fire Emblem, but based in science fiction. The campaign's pretty long, with 124 playable missions, though a lot of them are optional side quests. The game also made use of the transfer pack, which let you link up with a Game Boy entry to unlock additional characters and equipment. Super Robot Wars got good reviews when it came out in late '99, but sadly never left Japan. It's actually part of a long-running series that started in the early 90s on Game Boy, and continued into the present with over 50 sequels that cross over with famous mech franchises, like Gundam and Neon Genesis Evangelion. Just a few weeks ago, a Japanese N64 enthusiast called Neko Kabu discovered internal code inside Wars 64, revealing the devs tried to make the cartridge release compatible with the 64DD expansion, presumably for additional content, like missions, characters, and equipment, but there's not enough in the code to determine what the disc expansion would have done exactly. Likewise, it's unclear if an expansion was planned out or merely considered. Shogi is basically Japanese chess. Though it was originally brought from China to Japan in the 700s, modern shogi is only about 400 years old. It's a strategy game for 2 players and still popular in the land of the rising sun to this day. Morita Shogi 64 was announced for the 64DD, but ended up releasing on cartridge instead. Or at least, that's what it says on Wikipedia. But that doesn't make any sense, since Morita Shogi 64 released in early '98, while Shogi DD was announced in late '99. Both contradicting sources are cited by Wikipedia. What really happened is Seta Corporation made one shogi game as a launch title in '96, and then another in '98 with a modem connection port built into the cartridge. Plug in your landline cord and you can play other shogi heads over the internet. The only N64 game ever made like that. Then a year and a half later, Nintendo announced another game simply called Shogi. Other than that tentative title, there were zero details, like who was making it or how it would have improved on the cartridge release. We did, however, find an interview with Seta Corporation CEO, where he discussed ideas for a potential Shogi DD. In short, if the computer loses, it analyzes how it lost, he said. Then it learns, so the next time it faces the player, it won't fall for the same tricks. The difference, from the N64 version, is it learns from the player, and the game itself changes. I want to make this sort of, let's call it an automatic rewrite algorithm, to alter its own strategies little by little. End quote. In that regard, it'd be similar to Iwata's algorithm for Cabbage, using the DD's rewrite function to produce and save a self-learning AI. There's no proof that this was the same shogi that Nintendo announced was coming to the disk drive, but it seems likely, especially since Seta had already made 2 shogis, the second of which had netplay, and AI was their plan to move things forward with the disk iteration. On a side note, it's worth mentioning that N64 hacker Zoin Kitty recently discovered unique code in another N64 shogi game. Yes, there were 4 of them. That suggests it was originally developed for 64DD before moving to cartridge. That game, called AI Shogi 3, was made by i4 Corporation and released in '98 though, so it's definitely not the cancelled DD shogi that Nintendo announced in late '99. Ide Yuzuki is a celebrity mahjong player in Japan. Remember all of those Brain Age games where the real-life neuroscientist Dr. Kawashima kept your mind from aging like mush? Ide Yuzuki is like that guy, but for mahjong, the 4-player board game invented in China 200 years ago. In addition to playing professionally, Ide also starred in some video games. Ide Yuzuki's Master Mahjong for Nintendo Famicom, Ide Yuzuki's Mahjong Classroom for PlayStation, and lots more from 3DO to Wii. He was going to have a DD game too, called Ide Yuzuki's Mahjong School. Primarily aimed at beginners, the campaign mode put you in the shoes of a lodger living with the Murakama family who love mahjong. There were also a few other characters too, most notably Lisa the American exchange student, and Master Ide himself. You could play in tournaments, or just choose opponents you vibe with for free play. They all have backstories, make conversation, and part of the fun was reading their vocal and facial expressions, which you could use to inform your strategy. Outside of the main campaign, there was another mode for observing games from a real-life championship, with the benefit of Master Ide's commentary. At any point, you could push a button and take over one side of the game yourself, if you have the stones to challenge the pros. You could also play friends online and access other online features. Unfortunately, during development, Ide's Mahjong School got downgraded to a standard cartridge, then later canceled completely. Or at least that's what it says on Wikipedia. Truth is, it did come out in 2000. Mahjong wasn't as lucky as Shogi though, which got that modem connection port built into the cartridge. No more online features for Ide, sadly. Like DT Bloodmasters and Derby Stallion, Mahjong would have let 4 players plug in their Game Boys to use as controllers with screens, but that didn't make it in either. And of course, the final release was only in Japan, which is a shame, since it would have been good for gaijin who want to learn Mahjong.
Ready, go!
Mario Party came out in '98, followed up a year later with Mario Party 2, adding new boards and minigames. The internal code reveals the second game was actually intended as a disc expansion for the first, which is reflected on screen if you boot up Mario Party 1 with a random disc in the DD. The intro cutscene gets interrupted with an error saying to insert the correct disc, which doesn't happen with other N64 games, except the ones programmed to get expansions, like F-Zero and Ocarina of Time. In an alternate timeline where the DD released sooner like it was supposed to, and Party 2 was released on disc like it was supposed to, Mario Party 3 presumably would have been an expansion as well. From a technical perspective, it was indeed possible for one game to get multiple disc expansions. Both sequels came out on cartridge anyway, so it's not like we're missing out on content. We are missing out on money though, since carts typically sold for $60 and discs were $20 or $30. Now, I'm not butthurt about a few dollars all these years later, but it is an interesting footnote in DD history. And after that precedent was set, it'd be interesting to see how Nintendo handled the dozen sequels that came after. Wikipedia's list has one entry that's baffled us for months, simply labeled Namco RPG. Looking into it a bit further, it was reportedly part of the Tales series, which used to be one of the best-selling RPG series, earning itself about 20 sequels. The first game, Tales of Fantasia, came out on Super Nintendo in '95. A year later, a Namco spokesman told IGN a sequel was coming to DD in just a few months, implying the game's development was almost complete. At that time, Namco was expecting the DD was going to release soon. It didn't though, and Tales DD was never mentioned again. Namco did, however, reveal a new Tales game for PlayStation 6 months later, called Tales of Destiny. Initially, we thought Namco must have ported it from DD to PlayStation when they realized the DD wasn't launching as soon as they thought. But then we saw design documents proving Destiny was always meant for the PlayStation. Early Tales games were made by the same team, so it seems unlikely Namco had a second team making another unique Tales for Nintendo. Possibly they were going to dual release Destiny on PS1 and 64 DD, but that doesn't seem likely either, and the game's code doesn't suggest that was happening. The only other possibility is that Namco announced a fake game. But that doesn't make any sense, especially since they announced a sports game in that same interview, which did come to N64 in '97, just as they said it would. Frankly, we're at our wits' end with this one. What was Tales 64 DD? There's no details online, and all we could find in print was a Japanese blurb saying Namco's making a DD RPG, but, quote, no information at all. Just that it's being made. We tried to get a hold of the devs, but they didn't want to talk. We reached out to that Namco spokesman, but he never got back to us. We worked with fan group Life Bottle Productions trying to get to the bottom of this mysterious Tales game, and even with their rare interviews and knowledge of the code, they were just as baffled as we were. So in a similar case as Project Cairo, we just gotta throw up our hands and admit defeat. If you have any inside info or leads, you know where to find us. And now our final disc game. There's one easily overlooked, very boring sounding title on Wikipedia's list. It just says Communication Game, from the makers of PostPet, an email application. We looked and looked, but couldn't find any more details online or in print. We weren't sure if the game was even real. Nintendo also used the term communication game for Animal Crossing though. So we were curious, and reached out to Kazuhiko Hachiya, the creator of PostPet and presumed director of this communication game. And he told us yes, the project was real. It was a Marigal management game, just like DT Bloodmasters, Derby Stallion, and Cubivore. But the project ended midway through development for, quote, various reasons. We asked what the game was exactly, but apparently 25 years later, it's still a secret. As boring as Communication Game appears at a passing glance, we think it might have been more than it appears. Because while we don't know much about the canceled project, we do know a lot about Hachiya. We'll give you a quick rundown. In the mid-90s, email was a relatively new concept.
Email, or electronic mail, is a way of sending messages to someone computer to computer.
Hachiya's girlfriend didn't want to use email. She found it cold and complicated. So he made a little program where silly animals delivered emails for her. She loved it, and Hachiya hired a few friends to turn it into a full-fledged product called PostPet, the least efficient, most charming email inbox of all time. The way it works is PostPets hang out in your inbox, eating, dancing, using the litter box, and so on. When you want to send an email, a PostPet will grab it and disappear off screen, then appear on your friend's computer to deliver your message. Then they'll stay there for a while, demanding to be fed and pet, playing with their PostPets, and keeping a diary of how your friend treats them. When your friend emails you back, your PostPet will take it and come back home and tell you how it was treated. If it was treated poorly, it might not want to deliver any more emails to that person. Or maybe they'll just tear the email to shreds. On the other hand, if it was given food and love, it might start writing your friend emails all on its own. We could go on and on about how Postpet worked, but you get the idea. It was a huge hit and millions of Japanese people used Postpet instead of a regular email account. Hachiya got rich but refused venture capital so he could keep his team small and always aimed to do the opposite of what Silicon Valley does. New versions of Postpet are still being made today, vastly expanding on the original. Most notably a Nintendo DS version developed by Alpha Dream, the same studio that made the Mario and Luigi games. In the 90s, Hachiya also invented a jet-fueled skateboard based on Back to the Future, and tried to invent a TV telephone that'd fly itself to people you want to talk to. But he had more success recreating the fictional Maui aircraft from the Miyazaki film Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Here's Hachiya flying it himself a few years ago. He's also still a huge 90s gamer. To this day he calls himself an N64 fundamentalist. He's got one of the few 64 DDs in existence and still plays its games, like F-Zero and Ocean the Giant. He's a big Pikmin fan as well, and likes playing the new one on his Switch. So that's to say, whatever he was cooking up for the disk drive, it no doubt would have been imaginative. Possibly we're overthinking it, and Communication Game was just an intra-DD post-pet messaging system. But Marigold's involvement, the secrecy, and Hachiya's eccentricity leads us to believe it was more than that. Besides, the DD already had an email system built into RandNet. Maybe like Post-Pets and Animal Crossing, it could have become a huge franchise continuing into the present. Or perhaps just a one-off cult classic. Either way, it's a shame we'll never get to play it. And that brings us to the end of our list of 64 disk drive titles. By our count, we've covered 31 canceled new games, 9 expansions, and 3 ports. Another 13 games got downgraded to N64 carts, 3 were pushed to GameCube, and 4 jumped ship to competing consoles. Some lines are admittedly a little blurry, like with Simcopter 64 a port because it's based on a PC release, or a new game since it was getting completely reimagined. There's certainly room for debate, but we've categorized and tracked down sources to the best of our abilities. Though as we said before, we're not infallible, and there's undoubtedly information and entire projects we couldn't find. It's also worth noting that even the 9 games that did release were arguably incomplete. RandNet President Kayama said we could expect Japan Pro Golf Tour to get more post-release courses like Augusta and St. Andrews. Miyamoto talked about additional discs providing Crazy Taxi and other experiences within SimCity. The repeated delays and ultimate failure of the 64 DD was tragic. We basically missed out on half of a Nintendo console generation. Some of its ideas were reinterpreted in the future, but others got buried in the 90s forever, lost to time.